variety, of which I have some. I have friends and I have enemies, and my enemies see me as, a dangerous enabler of Trump. And I've noticed, I'm writing about this now, I haven't finished. Like, a lot of people have been trying to pin on me January 6th. The Flight 93 riot is a phrase that people are trying to introduce into currency, starting with Rich Lowry, a former friend who's become an enemy, and lots of others. But I saw, it's just something the other day on Law and Liberty trying to use this. They're trying to spread it around. Then again, I've got some other people who like what I say, like what I write, who see me, I think, as, somebody who saw certain things coming and got it right and tried to rally public opinion, or portions of public opinion, conservative opinion, around what I thought was the only real viable alternative in 2016 and in 2020. Obviously, it didn't work out. We lost. I put lost in quotes because I remain unconvinced that I know exactly what happened in the 2020 election. I'm not convinced it was stolen, but I'm not convinced it was fair either. And the one thing I'm convinced of is we're just never going to know. So I leave it to others, I guess, to say that. I do know that, as I said, I've got a lot of friends, I've got a lot of enemies, and most of my enemies are thankfully people I don't personally know. A handful of them are people I used to know who have decided to become enemies, and at that point, what are you going to do? Move on. I'd like to think that for every old friend who becomes a new enemy, I pick up a net at least 1.1 new friends, and usually it's more than that.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate that. Curvis, what do you think? What does the world think of you? How does that jive with what you think you're doing?
Well, the problem I have is I'm one of these kinds of writers who actually, there's an old thing that someone once said where they're like, I don't like to read my reviews because either they'll be good reviews or they'll be bad reviews. And neither of those things is helpful. So in a way, I think having as little knowledge or as little opinion as possible of what the world thinks of you is kind of the proper state for a writer. And it's certainly it's a kind of marketing. It lends itself to very, very bad and effective marketing. But I think that kind of marketing is sort of more effective over the long term because you're so focused. So many people, so many writers, for obvious reasons, are focused on what is, the world's opinion of me. If there is, as Michael said, a world, I'm like, first of all, I don't think there's a world. There's no world. There's lots of different worlds. Secondly, mainly my goal as a writer is to be able to survive and write. And so when you're trying to survive and write, actually the only people you care about, especially once you're in the business of writing, because I should pimp my Substack. I write graymirror.substack.com. which is actually, as Michael was telling me, I avoid looking at this. I'm still number 18 on the Substack political dashboard. So there's something, on the other hand, I've been doing this for 10 years, right? Not 10 years, really 14 years. So, with a little break in between to run a company. So that's a very different kind of marketing and thinking about marketing. And so you don't really count who are my friends, who are my enemies. Like Michael, I try not to have enemies. I think of the people on the other side very much less as enemies than as predators. I have, occasional, like Michael, I have occasional personal enemies, people who've just sort of gone weird, but that's really, really rare. And, when you're dealing with predators rather than enemies, there's a totally different set of tactics that come into play. Because it's like the lion versus the buffalo. It's completely asymmetric. You have no intention of hurting the lion. You have complete respect for the lion. If the lion eats someone else in a Machiavellian sense, okay, well, he didn't eat you, right? And so that's a way of thinking about security that's totally different. And so, to the extent that, do I have friends? Well, I'm sort of in a position where I don't really need friends because I'm marketing very directly through my Substack, which is a very high quality and available at graymirror.substack.com. And then do I need to not have enemies? Well, I need to not have anyone who can kind of try to personally destroy me. That's actually relatively rare. I think that to the extent that I'm cognizant of my sort of picture in the mainstream world, I think people have gotten very, very good at ignoring me. And that's something that as a prey species, I really, really welcome. I don't want to bother them. They don't find me easy to chew on. That's a great relationship, and in a Machiavellian sense, of course. And so that's that's maybe a little more complicated answer than Michael. I think Michael has some of the same things going on as well, because the fact is he's just too good. And one of the things they love to do is promote the second-rate people.
Well, I will say I do have it coming to a degree, because I do take these people on in a way that I would say, I don't know, Curtis, correct me if I'm wrong, but you tend not to, at least in the to the degree and with the frequency that I do. I'll just go right after the conservative intellectuals on point A, point B, point C. For instance, I took off after Jay Nordlinger. Now, granted, I was asked to do that. I was hired. The Law and Liberty came and said, we're doing a symposium on the weather underground. We would like you to be one of the guys who writes a response. So, okay, sure. It wasn't like I just read the piece and said, I'm going to go attack this guy. They asked me to do it. I read his piece. I thought, this is awful. And I wrote a fairly scathing response to it. And, it brings out people who get mad at me for having done that. So I don't so much complain about that. If I take the first whack, I should get hit back. It's the way these kinds of things go. And I've taken a lot of first whacks at people if I think that they're wrong, if I think that they're saying something that's unhelpful or, bad. I'm groping for the right word, something that helps make things worse. I will attack, and then I expect to be attacked back. I got an email from someone I never really knew, roughly a year ago, saying, a somewhat prominent person saying, oh, I've heard through the grapevine that you consider me an enemy, and I hope that's not true. And I had never thought about this person. I barely knew who he was. I don't know where he got that idea. And all I said back was, look, to write is to be criticized. So I don't even know or necessarily care what you think of me, but he really hated something that I had written, my review of, when did this come out? I don't even remember anymore. It was so long ago. Anyway, I reviewed a book called Bronze Age Mindset. I think it's coming on 2 years ago, which Curtis gave me, by the way. That's how I got that book. I think it was August of 19.
I knew I was giving you a poison pill there.
And I knew, so somebody saw it, and a guy got really mad, and he trashed it. I didn't even see that he trashed me for having written the review. Like, the book is terrible.
Oh, that guy. Yeah, let's not say his name. That guy, right.
Your book is terrible, and you're a terrible person for having written this review. And then he writes to me out of the blue saying, I've heard that you think that we're enemies, and I hope that's not true. And I'm like, I've actually never thought about you at all. But look, I wrote this piece knowing that I'd get criticized, and fine, I got criticized. Okay, no problem.
Curtis,
you credit for that madman line. Sorry.
You and I met a few years ago in Washington, D.C., and in fact, you shared with me that very same story of the lion and the buffalo. And I got to tell you that actually had a really big influence on me. I took that story. I took that story to heart because I had been spending a lot of time online jousting and writing direct response to other people on the other side and attacking things. And you know what, man? Like I encountered other prey animals, and I got wounded. I got doxxed, I got fired, I got shamed, swatted, the whole thing. That came after my kids, all of it. And that conversation you had with me inspired me to actually really create a private, robust community, a network of people where instead of seeking out these, attack situations on the plains, we kind of just go our own way for a little bit, stay healthy, get strong, and grow. And that's what we've been doing with the Little Order.
And they ignore you, right? I mean, it's important to never, it's just the mindset of the prey species is so different from the mindset of I'm a fellow lion, sort of hear me roar. It's a completely different, and it's like, the thing is that you can't understate, especially when you sort of encountered, especially personally, the evil that these kinds of people can do, you basically can't, it's very difficult to come to grasps with their sincerity. And yet, in general, their sincerity is complete, which makes them such effective predators. I was just reading this discourse between two journalists. I think it was Liz Lenz and the great Talia Lavin. Someone whose name ends with the same 3 letters as mine, right? And they're talking about being harassed, and these are people whose basically profession is that of a kind of soft Stasi going around and writing exposés that really destroy people's lives. And they're like, well, I got a nasty email. I was so upset I cried in the shower all morning. And those things to those people appear as like, they do not appear the way they appear to us. When these people use their power, they're doing good in the world. They're superheroes. They're fending off evil. And then, when these superheroes are basically assaulted in typically these crude, vile ways. By the way, I developed this prey analogy a while ago, but I can never get nasty emails. If I get a nasty email, it's always from some little bitchy thing from like some 17-year-old right winger. But I feel like one of those fish you see in a big aquarium that just drifts through the tank next to the sharks, right? And that's really the way you want to be. And when you understand that the sharks aren't really sharks, but they have this mentality of superheroes who are defending civilization against these evil, dark powers, and that they really believe that, then you're just like, why would I threaten these people? I want to actually help them. I want to help them see the world as it really is, and help them lose all of this fear they have so that they don't have to cry in the shower. And that's a much better pitch in a lot of different ways than the kind of aggro, LARPy 20th century pitch that, far too many people were into in 2015. And
so Curtis is a nicer person than I am, because I often see them and I think, I actually don't think these people certain of them are teachable, can't learn anything about the way the world is, and they're making the world worse by what they say. So I just, every once in a while, I'm somewhat lazy, or I work in spurts or whatever, but I'll go through, a 2 to 3 month dormant period, and then I'll spit out 3 or 4 fairly vituperative things, and people, then the predators want to come after me after I do that. And I have to accept that that's the natural response.
I have experimented with that a little bit, because now that I have a Substack, which is kind of a different thing from having a blog, where you really feel this urge to promote, you feel this desire to shill, it's sort of unquenchable. It comes from my Jewish soul. And and sort of in pursuit of this shilling, I went out and I actually attacked a couple of people. I attacked Noah Smith and I attacked Glenn Weil. I was really, I'm not really Noah Smith's enemy. I think I'm actually Glenn Weil's enemy, or he fears or hates me or something. But I was really defending Scott Alexander against Glenn Weil, and I was just beefing with Noah Smith. And the thing is, the difference between me beefing and Michael beefing is that I'm sort of well outside the Overton window of discourse, and Michael is kind of well within it. And so people find,
I don't know about that,
but whoa, a based penis measuring contest now.
I'm not saying there are pros and cons to both of these things, and there are very serious pros and cons to both of these things. But the point is that the problem is, when I beef with someone, you sort of because there are all of these ways in which it's very easy for me to hit him, in which he can't really hit back, he develops this sort of intense desire to be somewhere else. And that's a sort of fun dynamic, but it reinforces the determination of this person to really, very sincerely ignore you.
Just to defend to some extent my dissident street cred, when the Vegas conference was reported on in Politico or wherever it was, it was a typical point and sputter kind of article. Look who's there. These people are bad. Right. I will give no further explanation. Curtis and I were both mentioned and both quoted as saying whatever we had said at some, years in the past is just, this is all you need to know. These two people are there. They are bad. The conference is bad. So look, we may not exactly be in the same. But hey, come on! If I were quote unquote well within the Overton window,
that was a slip of the tongue. That was a slip of the tongue. I don't know how that came out. I meant to say exactly the opposite of what I said. I meant to say that you were touching the skin. You were in contact. Both. You could almost smell the clean air outside the beast, right? And so my apologies.
So guys, I love all of this. Let's get into some more substantive questions though. Here's the first one. Ready to go? Start with you, Michael, and then we'll go to Curtis for response. Is our current regime legitimate? If not, what regime level changes would you implement, sir?
Legitimate. Okay, I'm going to give a geek answer in part so that I can remain just on the side of the Overton window that is required to keep my current institutional affiliations. Aristotle gives an answer on legitimacy that's kind of circular or yin yang or chicken egg or whatever, right? The two things that make for legitimacy, one is longevity and the other is good government. So a king who's been around, a 10th generation monarch is legitimate simply because the family has been around for a long time. But if he governs poorly, he becomes over time illegitimate, and it's the right of revolution is therefore justified in casting him out. I just happened the other day to be looking at Shakespeare's Richard II, which is kind of what this play is about, right? Is Richard II legitimate? Now, if everybody, I don't know if anybody remembers the play, but the short answer is the dude gets deposed and is replaced by Henry IV. And Shakespeare seems to think that Richard is legitimate in the legal sense, right? He inherited it legitimately. He's from a line and so on, but he governs so poorly that it is just to kick him out because he's basically a tyrant, right? So, and then you have to ask yourself the question, and Aristotle sort of explores this, which is, well, where does longevity can't be the full and final answer because every regime had to originate somewhere. It had to be founded, right? It either was, founded like ours, like the American regime was founded, or it's founded by some heroic king or whatever. Right. So where does legitimacy originally come from? And it comes from replacing the bad with the good, or at least the worse with the better, for good intentions and building on those good intentions with good institutions, good government, and so on into the future. Right. Well, the American regime has been around for a while. It's actually fairly long lived as far as a republic goes. The oldest written constitution currently observed anywhere in the world. And as far as I know, the oldest written constitution ever observed in the history of the world. So we're at 246 plus years. On the longevity question, we'd have to say the American regime is legitimate. On the good government question, I would say the answer is quite a lot shakier. It's not governing well. It hasn't been governing well for a while. It also, as I mapped out, I think with some detail, lots of detail in my book, in particular, chapter 3, the stakes, the book is called, it doesn't govern according to the way it says it governs. So the United States was founded according to certain principles and certain rules. There's written law, there's the Constitution, there's the Bill of Rights, all this statute law. And the regime as it actually operates willfully, routinely ignores those things, contradicts them, does end runs around them. And then the final thing I will say on the legitimacy question is there's nothing in the original conception of the American regime that would enable or allow or encourage all this power sharing with big corporations and non-governmental entities with no democratic buy-in that just exercise plenary powers, either regardless of the will of the people or often in direct contravention to the will of the people. So those things would tell against the American regime's legitimacy. So I think that's a fairly, it's a somewhat difficult question to answer, but if someone is looking, my enemies, we might say, are looking for a pat yes. And any suggestion that there might be some problems with the American regime's legitimacy is just proof that you're a fill in the blank. But I think anybody who could give you a pat yes to that question in 2021 is either a fool or a liar.
Well, one way to summarize it, my response might be to say that Michael is more of an Aristotelian and perhaps more of a Platonist. I should also point out that it's very easy to tell that Michael is a lib because he's broadcasting with a copy of Emile in his background. But yeah, I have a very different answer. Which
grad school, man. I saved all my books.
I know. That's. I was expecting that was the answer. It's a very plausible answer. We won't ask again. But you could. Never too late for a change. But in any case, when I think about legitimacy, I think about it in a much more sort of Platonist, Schmittian, Machiavellian kind of sense. And my view is that yes, the regime is absolutely legitimate because it is much more legitimate. Legitimacy is not a unipolar question. If you're comparing the legitimacy of Richard II to that of Henry IV, that's a bipolar question. Is Henry IV more legitimate than Richard II? Is Henry VII more legitimate than Richard III? Very questionable little invasion he pulled there. But he succeeds, and because of his power, his regime becomes, completely illegitimate. And because Richard III is killed in the battle, there is no competing source of legitimacy. So, I would ask those who consider the American regime to be illegitimate to say, okay, what other regime would you prefer? Is there another, could the Canadians perhaps be in charge, the Australians? And there's simply no plausible answer to that question. There's simply no plan B. There's no regime B. There's no alternative people. There's no alternative ideas. There's basically no alternative nothing. And so that, to me, makes the regime completely illegitimate. If we compare that to the collapse of various recent regimes, for example, regimes that felt, as tangible and as solid and as permanent as ours, East Germany, the USSR, then even the Third Reich, then you see that those regimes basically had very, very tangible alternatives. East Germany has West Germany, the East has the West. And so they're like, when the USSR falls, it falls not of its own volition, but because it falls of the kind of the gravitational pull of this other model. And so the main thing for me that supports the legitimacy of the regime is simply the absence of an alternative. And any regime will be completely legitimate in the absence of an alternative.
So I'm not sure that there is an absence of an alternative. Now, in the Cold War sense that Curtis is talking about, of course there is, because if you look around, everybody who's just, let's say, every conservative who's dissatisfied with the present state of America and they think, I have to get out of here. You hear people mouth off like this sometimes, at least I do. Maybe that depends on who you hang out with. But then you think, well, where are you going to go, right? Is there some country somewhere that is closer to 1776, 1787, 1870, post-Civil War amendments, America functioning the way it's supposed to function without all of these layers of stuff that's been accrued in the past couple of generations? You look around the world, doesn't seem like it, right? Now,
right.
However, we know that this thing could exist because it has existed in the past. And so the alternative, I'm not sure, has to be something that you could literally pack your bags and flee to now. It could be something that could be a real possible successor. And then one other point I'd make very quickly is one of the things that made the regimes Curtis was talking about, late Soviet Union, the East Germany, illegitimate in the 80s, second half of the 80s when all of this was coming apart, was the fact that the people en masse had stopped believing anything that came from the government. I don't know that that's true in the United States to say that like 80, whatever, it's not 70, it's not 80%, it's not 90%, but something like 40%, maybe close to 50%, just don't believe things that they hear from the government or from the media or from official power centers anymore. They know they're being lied to. They know that there's nothing they really can do about the lies. That is, they can't challenge it and force the truth out, but they're tuning it out. And the more that happens, I mean, look at all of those trust metrics that places like the Pew Research Center do. There's almost no power center in American society, whether it be governmental, university, corporate, media, you name it, that's in positive territory. And most of them are absolutely in horrifically bad, tens, teens, and around there. That, and even if it's only, like I say, a plurality of the people who just don't believe anything that the government tells them anymore, or the universities or the media tells them anymore. That's a legitimacy crisis in and of itself, because it means at a minimum, you've got a completely bifurcated population, one of which believes it all and wants to tell you must believe, and the other of which just doesn't believe it and can't be forced to believe. So I don't know if we'll get to the, USSR circa 1987 point where it's the vast majority of the population knows everything is a lie. But I think you have a legitimacy problem even if 40% or 50% believes it's all a lie.
Can I push back on that a little?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Well, again, I take a much more Schmittian kind of realist approach to legitimacy than you do. And so when you talk about, things like majorities, I'm like, well, what you're doing there is you're weighting the whole population equally. And in reality, all societies are ruled by small minorities, and we have minority here, which is essentially the institute, the PMC, the professional mercantile class, as the super libs call it. And that's maybe 5 to 10% of the population that are core members of that, and then 20% that are aspirational members of that. And you see that in for example, there was a very fascinating poll that came out about a year ago where they went around and they simply asked people, do you think too much political correctness is ever sometimes a problem? Really, really weak, allowing people to voice their doubts in this really, really weak, gentle way, right? Do you have any doubts? And about 80% of them said yes. And the thing is, as long as that 80% is the 80% of the population that doesn't matter and doesn't have any mechanisms by which they can be made to matter, that's really cool. And actually what that does in the psychology of the true ruling class, it develops the psychology that I kind of inherited from my communist grandparents, my father's parents, who were, communists basically from the 30s or maybe in the late 20s through the 70s, where they have this sense that every aristocracy kind of has that you're sort of beleaguered by the peasants. And the more beleaguered by the peasants you feel, the more asabiya, the more togetherness you feel, and actually the stronger and stabler the regime becomes. Whereas what happens in the USSR and East Germany in their later days is that they start losing the support of their upper classes even in the 60s. Because the 60s has real effects in Eastern Europe. You have the Prague Spring. You've got all these people wearing, you'll see movies from the time, movies made in like Czechoslovakia, Poland in like 69, 70, everybody's wearing bell bottoms, right? That's not that shows you where the wind is blowing, right? People are not adopting Eastern European fashions in Brooklyn. Oh no, it's going the other way. And that direction of the wind is really very, very difficult to oppose. And so when you basically show me all these proles, and you say, well, here the power is with the people. First of all, it feels like you're repeating this kind of very, very stale 19th and 20th, even 18th century kind of propaganda about the power of the people. The second thing,
but I didn't say anything about the power of the people. I didn't, and I don't believe they have.
Well, then
I don't believe they have much power, if any power, in the present regime. I do think, though, that it's a problem. I do think it's a problem, though. I agree. Look, I agree with you on the basic point that it's even in a nominal democracy, in a nominal republic, a minority always rules, right? No question about that. Machiavelli says, I'm going to get the chapter wrong. Its discourse is like 138 or something. He says, in any republic, there are only 40 or 50 who command. I'm not sure I'm going to boil the number down that low, but it's low, right?
Not in this republic, but yes.
Their legitimacy does depend on, at a minimum, a kind of acquiescence from the bulk of the population. If 40 or 50% of the population knows that they can be pushed around at will, but also believes everything is a lie and that the ruling class is ruling solely for its private good and for the common good, you have a legitimacy problem there. And that's before you even get, if we want to be Greek again, to the Socratic question of, even if you can keep a thing going, right? Would Socrates say that the definition of legitimacy is simply whether you can keep a thing going, even if it's unjust and exploits the people and is anti the common good? I would say no. Even if you can make that arrangement go for 1,000 years, I would still dispute its legitimacy.
Here's the problem. We have really a philosophical disagreement here, and I think it's a philosophical rather than a substantive disagreement. And you're simply, the problem is when people hear legitimacy, they instantly and sort of unavoidably couple that to, they employ the just world fallacy. And so when they hear that a government is illegitimate, they conclude that it must be in some way weak. And so in a way, when you say this regime is illegitimate, you're giving people a kind of false hope, which they really ought not to have. And I don't think we disagree too much. I think
you're the first person ever to accuse me of giving anyone false hope. I'm usually accused of the exact opposite.
Well, then maybe, exactly. Then, fortunately, one man can be right and the whole world can be wrong. I think that
since you brought up Rousseau earlier, Voltaire famously said of Rousseau in a letter, when I read your work, I suddenly have the urge to get down on all fours and crawl. Most people, when they read my work, suddenly, every time I finish an Anton essay, I get this comment a lot. I just want to go slit my wrists. So I've never heard anybody tell me I'm giving people false hope before.
Well, actually, those things are perfectly consistent, because that means that you've basically pushed over as close to the edge of reality as you can without causing some kind of rash of suicides in the Midwest. And what that should make you realize is that there are two forces pulling on you. One is this force of indefinite optimism, which is still out there, and the other is this tremendous black pill. And the thing is, realizing that the black pill is actually, in a way, much bigger than any of these people could sort of possibly process, for me is actually a source of hope, because it indicates that it closes off many paths that people feel are realistic. Let me give you one example of that. So you said earlier, if this happened in the past, it can happen again. So that's sort of a statement of kind of, this alternative, okay, the Republic of 1776, existed, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the famous line of John Adams about, the Constitution being made only for virtuous, I think he says even religious, nation, and otherwise tyranny will go through it like a whale through a net. This is a motherfucker who has kind of close personal experience with this kind of fishing disaster, right? And when I look at this, I'm like, okay, wow, it went through it like a whale went through a net. And maybe not quite in the same way that John Adams expects, but there's a concrete connection here. And the concrete connection is that when you say, okay, here's this thing that could be as it was. Well, when you look at it as it was, and when you look at the average, Minuteman in Massachusetts in 1773, never mind the turbulent Samuel Adams rabble of the town. These people are really bad people. Never mind even the original Tea Party.
I know. I'm pretty sure I know where you're going with this.
You're pretty sure, right?
But
right. So the thing is,
no, but as you know, because we've talked about this, and I talked about it with Jack the last time I was on. I'm a pretty convinced that to me the most useful theory I get out of all the readings of the ancient philosophy and ancient history is the cycle of regimes. I believe it's true. I don't believe it's been either refuted philosophically. I don't think it's been overcome by history or by the quote unquote new science of politics. So I'm not predicting or calling for, I guess I am calling for, although I admit it's entirely unrealistic, calling for the restoration of 1776, 1787, the Founders Constitution. I freely admit I would love that, but I also don't think it's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next month.
I think it's completely impossible. It would be a disaster, and moreover, the Founders Constitution was, of course, the Constitution of 1787. What you're talking about is the Revolution of 1776, which was a complete disaster.
Both. All right. There's so much we could dig in here.
Let's drag it back up. Let's drag it out of the mud here. We're not revisiting these 250-year-old fights. Let's drag it out of the mud, and let's talk about the cycle of regimes. Because actually, Michael raised a really important point.
Republicanism. Okay, forget although I don't want to, but if we want to forget 1776, it seems ridiculous to me to think or assert or assume that however much longer humanity is going to live, it could be 1,000, 2,000, 5. I mean, who knows? Until we nuke ourselves or invaded by aliens or hit by an asteroid, that no small r Republican government with the kind of spirit that thumos that you're talking about that existed in the 18th century will ever arise again. It's not right around the corner. I freely admit that, but I don't think it's dead for all time.
Well, yeah.
I think it will come back at some point.
I think it will come back many, 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 many years in the future, and it will probably be a disaster then too. I would say that in regards to the cycle of regimes, one way that perhaps I differ a little bit from the ancients, the Anaciclosis, is that, of course, if you look at the Anaciclosis of Polybius, what you see is this path where Rupsum goes to tyranny, which goes to oligarchy. And in my view, basically right view.
No. In Polybius, it goes from monarchy or heroic kingship to tyranny, to aristocracy, to oligarchy, to democracy, to anarchy, and then back to heroic kingship.
Right. In any case, my view is that cycle is the cycle of basically rising and developing societies. And when you look at declining and decaying societies such as ours, that cycle should run in the opposite direction. And so really your correct example there, your correct exemplar there is more Republican Rome, where you're looking at a republic whose ethos of Republican virtues is completely decayed, which has basically been replaced by this kind of aristocratic power struggle, which uses democracy as sort of
my only
tool.
objection here, Curtis, is that you're saying all this as if I hadn't written it out at length in a number of different places, and I'm hearing it for the first time. It is in my book. probably more detail than I'm aware of anybody else having even attempted this analysis.
It's not the first place you go, and so, essentially, when you go back to the question of republicanism, one of the things, I think Froude says this in Oceana, maybe, which is his history of kind of the British Empire from a Victorian perspective. He says, when you look at history, one of the things you see that these periods of democracy produce these great flowerings of artistic and intellectual output. And everybody agrees with this when they compare regimes, even the people that are not into democracy. They also see that, to quote John Adams, it soon wastes and exhausts itself. And Froude compares this to the flower of the century plant, which basically grows for many, many years, just sitting there sticking out these agave arms, right? And then grows this like 40-foot tall flower and then dies completely. And so you see that, here's this radical degradation of virtue. And it's that virtue that made Republican forms of government possible. I mean, one of the analogies I like to use is if you compare, there's a kind of nice bookend between January 6th, which was sort of this amazing Marxian history repeating as farce event, and say the mobs of London
I'm told we're supposed
500
to take that
years ago.
The utmost seriousness.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm going to decline to do that. And if you compare that to the mob of London, say 500 years ago, who would be like the apprentices of London, hear a rumor that the German traders at the steel yard are undercutting them on the price of wool or some such bullshit. So let's go kill all the Germans in London. And like, Mary Tudor or whoever, has no standing army, like, no way of enforcing the law against this turbulent mob whose law is itself. And that was the assumption in American politics. That was the assumption behind democracy for so many years. Look at the New York City draft riots in 1863, just incredible scenes of just maniacal chaos. As late as the 40s, you still have black on white riots in which whites attack and kill blacks. Doesn't happen anymore. And the thing is, I'm not saying that was a good thing. I'm not saying any of these riots were a good thing. The riots were a measure of the enormous level of popular energy that was present in the population at that time. Not even virtue in the sense of John Adams, just whatever it is that is the opposite of apathy. And today, basically, when people sort of engage in this political philosophy, they're kind of calculating, they're like engine designers designing the next generation of Audi engine. This is going to get 168 horsepower at 2000 RPMs, and then someone comes and tells you, oh, by the way, your engine has to run on apple juice. And so you've just got to throw sort of all of that out. And so this idea of having sort of power coming from the bottom up in any realistic and any kind of sustained controlling sense is out of the question. And the way I would, the optimistic lesson that I would take from that is that maybe if you're actually trying to design an engine that runs on apple juice, rather than trying to adapt your gasoline engine to apple juice, you might actually be able to create something that might actually roll down the goddamn road. But sort of everybody's stuck in this kind of performative model of politics, which is essentially unchanged since you had this level of energy, and you just can't get anything done with that. Does that resonate, Michael?
Sort of, but this is another odd thing for me to say, which is it sounds a little too fatalistic. I mean, you and I, we've had this conversation before. I think you and I see 2021 more or less the same way, and what the power structures are and what the problems are and so on. We really differ on the analysis of how we got here. And I think maybe we differ a little less on what to do now, but I'm definitely a lot more normie on what to do now and what going forward than you are. Although I'm not going to rule out as an analytical possibility simply for what you might call moral reasons. The notion that the regime could get so degraded that we could end up with something like the type of monarchy that you actively call for, that I don't. But certainly political philosophy, cycle theory would say, yeah, when you get into a degraded state like this, the state becomes impossible to govern. You end up with a kind of administrative monarchy that, frankly, that's exactly what in my interpretation. Well, it's my teacher's interpretation, but I think it's fairly accurate, right? This is what the Shakespeare's Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra are all about: the impossibility of republicanism in a non-virtuous people, in a state in which all of the underlying currents and phenomena that made Republican government possible are no longer there, and only the forms remain. And how do you transform that into essentially administration? And that's what those plays are about. And I think that's what essentially Roman history, the transition from republic to empire, is about. I think Machiavelli completely agrees with that in his analysis, and that may be what the United States is heading into. Then the question becomes, for me, and I did say this fairly clearly in my book, who's going to be in charge and for what ends? I use the terms blue Caesar and red Caesar. And the big problem, I mean, aside from the fact that I will not like life under blue Caesar, the other problem I have with it is I think so much of what blue government is trying to do right now is anti-natural, that even if it doesn't generate a real pushback from the populace, and I regard that as a 50-50 question. Sometimes I'm more mopey, I think, God, people are never going to have enough, and just say, I've had it. And then sometimes I get optimistic and think, I see signs of life. People are getting angry at all of this crap. But whether that happens or doesn't happen, so much of what they're trying to do, I think, is anti-natural in this, that it will crash of its own accord. The same way that the conservatives used to, or at least certain strain of conservatives used to take solace, even when the Soviet Union seemed very strong, by saying, listen, if we're right about what we believe about politics, economics, and so on and so forth, their whole thing is unnatural, contradicts fundamental laws. It can't last. It cannot work for the long term. I've said this before. If modern conservatism is correct about what it claims to believe about philosophy and virtue and religion and politics, then the woke managerial tyranny that we have today, or we're drifting toward, cannot last. And if they can make it last, conservatism, all the intellectuals, all of them, the libertarians, the paleocons, the neocons, the religious cons, all of them, the economics cons, they all have to rethink their fundamental premises, because if the ruling class we have now can make what they have right now keep going for any indefinite length of time, it means all of conservatism for the past 2,500 years has been false.
Okay, that is a great. I'm just going to step in here. I can sit here and just listen to you guys go this whole time. I do have some semblance of structure that I wanted to go with here, but you guys have actually been flowing through a series of questions that I had established. And one of them was, is the democracy as the founders envisioned still possible, or was it even ever? And I think that you guys addressed that more or less. And we're flowing now into the next question I had, which was, what is the end game of the woke tyranny look like, right? Because Michael, I agree with you in that if you just analyze the circumstances and apply it with the model that I believe to be true, what they're doing does seem to have absolutely no longevity possible, right? It's a self-destructive thing that should come apart on its own. But what does it look like for us while we're living through it? What does the end game of the woke tyranny look like? What does it look like to you, Curtis?
Well, if I can answer that at the same time as answering Michael, I do unfortunately hear a lot of what sounds like cope here. I hate to hear it. I hate to point it out, but this is cope, and the self-winning victory is the bugaboo of conservatism. You always hear it. You hear, this is a self-destructive thing. It's going to end in its own game. Let me lay out a couple of different angles. We have the future. We here in America have the future very, very near us. We can see the future very, very clearly. All you got to do is drive south. And you see, the structure of third world governance in all of its various forms. It has a Cuban aspect. It has a Venezuelan aspect. It has an Argentinian aspect. It has a Brazilian aspect. Certainly, as we open the borders and we mix these populations more thoroughly, those realities become much, much more manifest. And so you can picture a U.S. in 50 or 100 years that is in some ways very, very similar to Mexico today. And the fact is, if you really have any money at all, it's possible to live very well in Mexico. And life in Mexico is very good for the Mexican elite. The people you see on the telenovelas, the fresas, or as conquistador Americans, as Steve Saylor calls them, they live fine. As for Los Estados Unidos de Mexico, and its beautiful constitution, and it's a fucking joke. And you can also clearly see the future in that because you see parastate entities exercising more and more authority. This is, again, similar to the decline of the Roman Empire, where you have these mysterious groups called the Bagaudae, which appear to have been just like Romans who went rogue and, started living in a barbaric way. You have all of these things can play out even in Mexico for 50, 100, 150, 200 years. Over time, I think you will start to see a recognition that the real government is whatever narco gang manages to unify to unite the tribes, but that's a very, very clear future. That's sort of your path to barbarism. That was, the sort of path to barbarism that late Rome followed. You can take that path and eventually you'll end up with a new kind of monarchy through that form. Many, many pieces of the old world will still be intact. It's kind of Mad Max. And your alternative is basically not to go full Mad Max and instead to perform the same kind of transformation that really saved the Roman world late, in that period. Another, let me go a little more far-fetched and, with a slightly more northern example. When I was, until recently, of the glorious Bay Area, when you look at what people think and the way they live in the Bay Area, I think it's not unimaginable that by the later 21st century, mandatory universal sterilization could be a viable political alternative. I could see people supporting that. And that would be a very, first it would be optional. It would be like a good thing that you did. Then it would be like you would be sort of disgraced for not doing it. Then, bam, everyone would have to do it. They would live out their lives happily and disappear. Whether they could enforce that on the whole planet or not, I greatly doubt. But, that strain has existed in the West before. You see the Shakers and so forth. Also, basically a puritanical kind of people. So that's one, kind of model for voluntary human extinction that I think you could start to see become politically viable in a few generations. So yeah, actually you could continue to fuck around with this conservatism bullshit and we could see whether either of those futures happens. There's probably more, kind of dire black hills that I can think of, but those are just the two that come to hand.
We're going to lock arms and walk hand in hand into the ocean together, huh? Is that what's going to happen, Michael?
The idea that collapse is a victory, I reject, and is a mistaken interpretation.
No. I don't think of it. Sorry, go on.
Because it would be hell for all of us to live through. Even if what resulted on the other side is superior to this, it would be hell for all of us to live through. But it also would be in no sense a victory because we wouldn't have brought it about, right? The Russian people ultimately did not bring down the USSR or communism. It wasn't. Even though I would say Russia in 2021 is better than Russia in 1989, right? They didn't win a victory. Their thing broke because it didn't work anymore. And that's all I'm saying about woke managerial tyranny. The other reason to doubt, which I did spell out in my book, in fact, I think I called the whole chapter "Reasons to Doubt," and I went into detail. I've been hearing the following argument for a long time, which sounds like what Curtis just said. You even mentioned Brazil, but people said Brazil is the future of the USA. The reason to doubt that is possible in the following sense is that I think we underestimate the extent to which dysfunctional regimes around the world exist and function to the extent that they function under an umbrella of U.S. military, economic, and political power. And if the United States becomes as dysfunctional as they are, can Mexico still be Mexico without El Norte above doing all of the things that it does? I think Curtis and I would certainly agree that the United States is not nearly as competent at the tasks it sets itself internationally, to say nothing of domestically, as it used to be. Once it is as incompetent, or medium competent, if we want to say, these other countries don't shoulder these kinds of quasi-imperial responsibilities. And I'm not saying it's a wonderful thing that America does and we have to keep it going forever. I am saying that in its absence, it is probably unrealistic, or certainly not evident, that the United States could simply transform itself or devolve into a country like that and just go on, when the system that we have, that all these countries exist within and under, depends on the exercise of U.S. power in a way that the U.S. seems increasingly incapable of doing, and even less and less capable of doing as it becomes more and more ridiculously ambitious about it. So I don't. Look. Like I said, I'm usually the black pill guy in a lot of respects. I'm not convinced that good things are coming. I'm convinced that good things are possible. And a lot of what Curtis says sounds plausible, but in a way, I'm going to say it could be worse than what if what Curtis just predicted happens. I think it'll be worse than the way he said, because there won't be this overarching security umbrella, economics, all of it. Granted, it's jury rigged and strung together and very fragile, but without it, if the U.S. just becomes another dysfunctional quasi third world country, I think being able to live like an elite in Mexico or Brazil can live now is not going to be nearly as possible as Curtis thinks, because a lot of that possibility depends on even, quasi-competent exercise of U.S. power, which will be gone, either both the competence and the power.
Well, Michael, you did work in the U.S. National Security Administration, so literally in the U.S. National Security Administration. So
no, I didn't. No. Technically, the National Security Administration, the NSA,
Council.
Agency,
Yeah.
I did not work for it.
Sorry, brain fart.
Those are the guys who read your emails.
You worked in national security. You worked in national security in the administration, is what I meant to say. And if you look at the NSC and specifically the term national security, this is a very interesting term that dates to the 30s and 40s. It really dates back to when Roosevelt said our frontier is on the Rhine, which is, I believe, a river in Texas. And that euphemism, one of the things that was so fascinating about the whole series of shit that went down in 9/11 was that suddenly they had to invent this new term. They came up with this term, Homeland Security. What is Homeland Security? How is it different from national security? And that was a little bit Orwellian. And the truth is that what national security has meant since the 1930s, arguably since the kind of the inquiry in the teens and 20s, the whole sort of very early days of the international community, going back to even like the whole Cecil Rhodes world, you have this whole concept that the security defending the United States depends on holding this umbrella over Uruguay or whatever the fuck. So, we have these treaties with like Portugal where it's a national security treaty, and the treaty says that if Portugal is attacked, the United States will defend it. And if the United States was attacked, Portugal will help defend us. This is literally the language of NATO. And it's all a bunch of crap. And let me tell you what I think would happen if the U.S. simply renounced the whole umbrella, closed its embassies, said, okay, let's take Mexico as an example. We said to Mexico, okay, you know what our new policy with respect to Mexico is? Our new policy is with respect to Mexico is the policy that was set out in the Monroe Doctrine Address. Not with respect to Latin America, but with respect to Europe. And one of the phrases in that address from, 1830, something like that, which was actually, I think, ghosted by John Quincy Adams, and which was inspired by Canning, the British Foreign Secretary, was the policy with respect to Europe is, and I quote, the government de facto is the government de jure for us. Meaning that basically whoever's in control of the goddamn country is in charge of it and can do whatever he wants. Well, if you go back through Mexican history, there's this wonderful saying in Mexican politics. I believe this is due to Porfirio Diaz, where he said, "Por ver México tan lejos de Dios, tan cerca de los Estados Unidos." Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. I'll tell you, an interaction I had once with a Mexican. This was some venture capital thing. This Mexican is now, I think he's a billionaire now, but that was long before we were just kids. And so I sit down next to this guy, and I'm like, hey, we're going to like a whitewater rafting thing or something. And I'm like, hey, where are you from? And he's, what's your name? He's like, my name is Juan. I'm like, where are you from, Juan? He's like, Mexico. I'm like, oh, let me tell you about my favorite Mexican, Porfirio Diaz. That's kind of like saying, let me tell you about my favorite American, Richard Nixon. So he's like, oh, let me tell you about my favorite Mexican. I'm like, who? He's like, Hernan Cortez, right? So, one of the things you have to remember about the country to our south, whose true name, by the way, is New Spain, that under the Spanish Empire, this was actually by far the most conservative part of the Spanish Empire, as many empires are. They used to say when you entered Rhodesia, you should set your watches back 50 years. The Mexican nobility was still a thing. The people who are descendants of the Mexican nobility very much know that. They only breed with other Mexican nobles. And if you tell this country, hey, you can do whatever you want, there will be some general down there who was like, as long as they take you completely seriously, really, at your word, this is a true policy, you're like, okay, I could just basically take power and shoot all the drug dealers, forget this ridiculous system of justice that America has saddled me with, restore order in the goddamn country, go full. And, if you go to Mexico, anything that still works down there was basically made by Porfirio Diaz. What happened when Porfirio Diaz was overthrown? Well, he was like, okay, guess democracy is the future. Let's go back on a, democratic future. Someone attempted to, Huerta, I believe, attempted to basically continue his rule. Woodrow Wilson's like, no, you're going to have democracy. So you're going to get it good and hard. So we're going to support Carranza. And then the radicals in America, which is why he still has a good name in the U.S. And, or for example, during the Civil War, Napoleon III was like, oh, well, I guess, wow, the Monroe Doctrine isn't really operational anymore because you seem to be fighting for your life. So let's restore order in Mexico. We'll get an Austrian prince and put him in charge in Mexico. Well, if you find something in Mexico that works, that was not put there by Porfirio Diaz, that does not date to the Spanish, it was very likely put there by Emperor Maximilian. Civil War ends. It's over. What is the, the first action of the U.S.? It's like basically, I forget if it's Grant or Sherman. It's like, oh, now we have this giant army. Hey, France, do you want to fight us too? Better pull out of Mexico. And that's how the Maximilian period ends. So the thing is that you have to understand that when people accuse the U.S. of supporting Pinochet in Chile or something like that, what they're really saying is you didn't do enough to oppose him. And if you withdraw that umbrella, what you're going to see in every country in the world is you're going to see indigenous forces rapidly realize that they can go basically full Paul Kagame and restore all the goddamn order that they want. So when that umbrella vanishes, yes, in the long term, that'll create enough for other imperial powers. But if that umbrella were to actually vanish, you wouldn't see Mexico or Brazil fall to pieces. You'd see an amazing restoration of civilization in those countries.
Well, all right. I'm completely not convinced of that, but I also want to be clear that Curtis seems to be convince you. Curtis seems to be attributing to me the views of the national security establishment, meaning that the United States needs to insist on that every country live up to whatever particular interpretation of liberalism the United States has at a given moment, and that if we anybody who falls short is therefore a moral leper in U.S. policy eyes and will be treated as such and sanctioned and so on. I agree. The United States national security state really does do a lot of that. I am in no way endorsing that view. And in fact, I'm sympathetic to the view, although I don't understand international economics well enough to say whether this is true or not, that the whole global system, the trade system, the currency, the banking, the financial, you name it, is jury-rigged together in an unstable way. I'm just saying that I believe it is a fact that the U.S. is at the heart of it, this entire security system, that if you were to pull that, it's the bolt in the machine, that one bolt that if you pull out, I think the whole thing may collapse. And so the confidence that we could just become like one of these other, just devolve into this other country, into the status of one of these other countries, and all would be well, including in those other countries, I don't think is true. Now, I would definitely like to see, if I had any power or influence, the United States pretty vastly scale back its foreign ambitions, but in a fairly careful way, with an eye toward what's good for us. again, my main objection is simply that I think the assumption that the U.S. can fall and become like one of these other countries. We're not like another country, unfortunately. We're not. We are and have been since at least 1945, and probably since before that, the linchpin of this so-called liberal international order. And if we go away, if and when, I think when is the better case, because nothing lasts forever. Nothing political or human lasts forever. If and when we go away, the world is going to look much more fundamentally different than I think most people who contemplate this have thought. Or I think we're going to be in some very seriously uncharted territory that serious folks haven't really begun to think through. And I think it could also be very bad for us domestically, at least in the near term. That's not to say, first of all, and I'm not sure we could stop it, but and second of all, it may well be necessary that we give up all of this stuff, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that we can just kind of, and even if, Curtis, as you say, okay, let's go back to the Roman analogy, right? When the Romans transitioned from the Republic to the Empire, they did the opposite of a retrenchment. After the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, they stopped the expansion because they realized, well, we've sort of reached the limits of where the marginal cost of conquering more barbarians actually benefits Romans. And we're losing battles, and these guys are too tough, and what the hell do they have that we want anyway, right? But they didn't give up any of the stuff they had already conquered. They essentially used the transition from republic to administration to maintain global world order. Blue Caesar, as I have termed it, would be that type of emperor, the type of monarch, however you want to put it. If he were to come to pass, the blue regime would do everything it could to maintain U.S. forward presence abroad, maintain U.S. diplomatic intervention and entanglements with as many countries as possible, and to maintain the U.S. centrality in the financial and economic systems, to use as leverage over other countries to say, you've got to be as woke as we are or we'll punish you. Red Caesar, on the other hand, I think would be a lot more open to a retrenchment and a pullback, but also and much more concerned about domestic politics with what goes on here. I mean, these are two flavors of the same thing. Once republicanism becomes impossible, if in fact it's not followed by complete collapse or breakup, if it's followed by a regime that keeps the continental, or all 50 states for that matter, United States intact, how is it going to govern domestically and how is it going to govern internationally? I think we know the answer from Blue Caesar. Domestically will be like it is now, but more so. And internationally, it will be hanging on by its fingernails to all of the influence and influence is much too soft a word. Somewhere between influence and empire that Washington has built up since 1945 and really before that. Whereas I think Red Caesar would be willing to give a lot of that stuff away.
Couple of different things. One, I think one of the most basic ways that Michael and I disagree is that I believe there's only one color of Caesar, and that's obviously purple, right? So it actually kind of fits. The second thing is that when you look at this kind of structure and the way the American empire works, I think you have to really very strongly differentiate the military and diplomatic power and even the cultural power from the financial power. The financial power is even greater and more important than I think most people think. It's a very, very powerful, force. And as Michael said, it has to be deconstructed very, very carefully. The military and diplomatic could be shut down tomorrow and no American would notice the difference for at least 10 years. So I really, really disagree on that. I think that the military diplomatic projection of power around the world has been a self-looking ice cream cone for well over 100 years. I think that it's a manifest demonstration of the reality that the purpose of the federal government has begun to aggrandize itself rather than to serve the interests of the population. I would shut down the whole machine. I would prohibit anyone who had worked in it from ever working in anything like the same area again. And that's, I think that's a moderate position. And so obviously we disagree on that. One of the interesting things,
not necessarily. Again, all I'm warning about is unintended consequences or unthought through consequences. I don't know that we can walk up to this Rube Goldberg machine, pull out the one bolt, and have it clash, and then we're just like everything's going to be fine. I'm not sure. I've never heard.
The financial thing has to be shut down in a very, very structured way. The financial thing has to be shut down cleanly. Financial systems at this level of tension cannot. You're absolutely right about that. It goes like the Soviet Union, goes completely haywire. You can't basically let the ship burn.
Let me inject here on the financial thing. How could there be an orderly breakup of the global monetary system that we've implemented? Like, what would be orderly about that? Wouldn't that have to be, by almost definition, cataclysmic and sudden?
No, because the person who can print money can do anything. And so you're essentially looking at something that's just a sort of very, very complicated, structured international bankruptcy in which a lot of assets get monetized at their current market price. And so you're basically saying, here's this financial market, it's operating. Yesterday you had this portfolio full of stocks and, you know, all this bonds and all this bullshit. Today we've converted all of that to dollars in your Fed account. So your purchasing power has not changed, but we've reset the casino.
So you're saying an orderly workout initiated by the United States?
That's right.
And what would be the political and financial incentives that would make that happen?
Well, the political and financial incentives. Let's talk about the
not for the current ruling class anyway.
First. Oh no! This would only be done as this would be a part of a regime change. So the way this worked in the Soviet Union was very, very interesting. So basically, Gorbachev had this policy, who didn't really understand that he was sort of committing regime suicide, but he was, of course, committing regime suicide. Had this policy of liberalizing his power in the rest of the Warsaw Pact, which did a couple of things. It basically, you know, gave sort of momentum to his enemies, which is always a Machiavellian, anyone else will tell you, is a big freaking mistake. And he gave a lot of momentum to his enemies, and he caused a lot of people in Czechoslovakia and Poland to be like, hey, this Warsaw Pact thing, maybe it really isn't about Poland at all. Maybe socialist brotherhood is a bunch of crap. And so it sort of, it decayed, you know, this kind of the substance of the empire. And as the kind of intellectual substance of the empire decayed, people sort of rapidly, not even so much stopped believing in it, but started to see that it was acceptable to stop believing it. The result of that was that you gave enormous impetus to all of these forces in the periphery, where basically in East Germany and Poland and whatever, the people were like, they sort of came out of the state of learned helplessness in which they'd learned that nothing that they could do could possibly work. They tried their 1950, you know, Berlin Revolution. They tried their Trump. They tried their Tea Party. Didn't do shit. And then suddenly they start to realize, hey, you know, we could have a Prague Spring or a Hungarian Revolution, but it would actually work and go all the way, and we could be part of the EU, which I guess was the European community at the time. They weren't quite thinking that literally, but that was sort of, that prospect was clearly, that was the telos that they could understand. The net result was that you had these revolutions in these countries, right? Where suddenly, you looked at these countries and you realized that these regimes were completely illegitimate. In Michael's sense, you had this complete preference defalsification. And then the people in the center looked back at the periphery and said, holy crap, maybe our regime is a bunch of crap too. And so you had this sort of wave that pushed outward and then went backward. And so the wave that would push outward and then go backward, if, say, the United States freed its colonies, is, for example, the provinces, or whatever you want to call them. Colonies isn't really right. The United States might say to France, hey, France, we had this relationship. It was complicated. It was interesting. It was wild. But let's go back to the old John Quincy Adams way. And, for us, actually, the legitimate government in France is whoever's in control of Paris. You can actually paint a big QR code on the Champs-Élysées on our satellites and pick it up. And that'll tell us where to send our emails. And if we have any problem with you, the French, for example, I don't know what would come up. We'll obviously keep buying your wine. American wine has only gotten worse. And I can't drink American Reds anymore. It's amazing. And, but so we'll have to keep buying your wine. Probably there's some things that you want from us, buffalo hides or beaver skins or something like that. So the trade will continue, paid for cash on carry, of course. And if we have to talk about anything, we'll send you an email at this address. And other than that, as for your government, Louis the 20th, he's out there. You could do that. You could go full Bonaparte, full Paris Commune. Let your Greek flag fly, go full leftist. Voluntary human extinction.
Right. Look, I actually agree with that. I think it'd be much easier for the United States to disengage from Europe than it is from, say, Northeast Asia.
It could be done by mere
or the Middle East
action. And the result of that disengagement is
no, but I mean,
say,
I don't mean easy in the instrumental sense. I mean easy in that there probably wouldn't be any serious consequences, and there might not be serious consequences to the disengagement of other places too. It's just harder to make that case.
The consequence is that you would see. The consequence is, if I can finish with my little narrative, the consequence is that you would see France rapidly becoming France again. And Americans would see France rapidly becoming France again. Moreover, Frenchmen would see France rapidly becoming France again. And moreover, you could say to France, hey, France, remember when John F. Kennedy made that speech about Algeria, 1956 or whenever it was, earlier than that, the famous Algeria speech that was written by Schlesinger or someone, that was like, France, you got to get out of Algeria. Well, this whole thing of decolonialization, the reality is what happened. It wasn't the wind of change. Actually, what happened is we stole your colonies and we burned them. So, if you want to do that, if you want them back, not our problem. If Algeria wants to colonize you, hey, you know what? Go for it, Turks. It's none of our business anymore. The Barbary pirates should avoid capturing our ships, I guess. And going back to that, you would just rapidly see this rebirth of Europe. And when you saw this rebirth of Europe was just incredibly, people that made Viktor Orban look like Mahatma Gandhi, Americans, I think, would take a lesson from that, and they would be like, wow, actually, the wind of change, the irreversible tide of history can be completely reversed.
All right. I don't even know where.
That was quite a bit to digest there, sir.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, first of all, in an instrumental way, I don't mean the instrumental way of withdrawing from these places. That's obviously the easiest thing to do. If you have the political will and you can get the personnel in, which is obviously very difficult to do, as Trump saw. He wins an election and he finds it extremely difficult to, some of this is his own fault for appointing people he shouldn't have appointed and so on and so forth. I'm just saying that getting out of Europe wouldn't be particularly difficult for the United States, and I'm not even sure it would have. I mean, what does being in Europe really mean? That's why the word empire when it comes to the USA is so inapt. I mean, we don't really, aside from Guam and Puerto Rico, arguably, and a couple of other places, we don't have colonies anymore. I mean, we have these things called territories, and there are very few of them, and they're not very populous, and so on, and they're certainly not economically instrumental to American prosperity the way, say, the British Empire was absolutely the linchpin of British prosperity in the 19th century. I mean, you can't imagine Victorian England without India and the wealth that supplied, a country that was many, many times the size of Britain, both in terms of territory, population, and so on.
But Michael, isn't our empire more along soft power, NGO power, currency power, petrodollar, all that? Doesn't it have the same effect?
Yeah, sure. Well, does it have the same effect? No, not exactly. It is definitely a soft empire, and it's increasingly being used. Not increasingly. I mean, it's been actually quite a while. It's just now it's more evident than ever that it's used in ways that don't necessarily benefit. I mean, look, the original rationale for the soft empire as it was the world has been blown to bits. If we don't get in and backfill the power vacuum in certain spots, communism will take it over. And now you could argue that was a misjudgment of the sort of present at creation generation, to borrow the title of Dean Acheson's memoirs. But that was the argument that they made to themselves and to the American public. We don't want to do this. We have to do it. If we don't do it, the chances that the communists will run the table are non-trivial, perhaps high, and we could be then faced with a world in which the balance of power has tipped so far against us that we don't know what to do anymore. Obviously, that circumstance is absolutely not prevalent today anymore, certainly not in Europe. Anybody who worries, I mean, the Russia freak out hysteria of the last 5 years is one of the most ridiculous pieces of nonsense. I'm groping for words because nothing is really large enough to capture how big a lie and how false all of that was. I'm not dissing Russia as a great power or the big country, lots of land, lots of nuclear weapons. I respect Russia in a lot of ways, but Russia's ability to invade and conquer Western Europe or Eastern Europe, much less Western Europe, is not high. It's not a serious threat to Paris, to Berlin, to London, to any of these things. And so, what are we doing there? And why as Macron has said, like why, Curtis said a second ago, France would immediately go back to being France. That I don't believe, or at least I would love it. I'd love like nothing more to believe that. I like France. I want France to be as French as possible. Macron is complaining that American woke doctrines are infecting his country, and he's right to complain, and he should complain. But I think he also misdiagnoses the problem to an extent, and that is to say, these woke doctrines, they might be right now and they're fulsome in America, but there's something deeply Western about the trajectory of public opinion in the West, that is to say, in Europe, in the United States, in the Anglosphere. We're all kind of in this together because we have the same mother civilization. We share the same ultimate cultural heritage. We read the same books. The same intellectual tradition is there. It's not an accident that we all became stupid and corrupt in the same way at more or less the same time. And that it spreads like when one country gets it, it spreads through all of them like wildfire. So the whole West is infected with this kind of stuff. France didn't just, suddenly you open a package at Orly Airport one day, and I'm straw manning Curtis here, but it was this Pandora's box from America, and they opened it, and all of a sudden France went woke, right? If you trace the history, if you trace the history of Western Europe, Western public opinion. Curtis brought this up, the same point he made before. I'm going to use it against him now. Okay, he's like, well, why were they wearing bell bottoms in the Eastern Bloc in the '60s? You could also add, why was it the most coveted thing you could smuggle into Russia in the '80s was Levi's, or in the '70s was Beatles records, because all of these countries are sort of civilizationally united, and they rise and fall, and they together to a degree. And public opinion and elite opinion tracks together to a degree. I don't think there's ultimately no disaggregating the United States from the West more broadly, however much we may want and should. I want to be clear, should, because I know there's going to be lots of Twitter traffic saying like, Anton, I always knew you were a cuck. You're endorsing the globalist U.S. empire, right? No, we should be retrenching and pulling back. But it's just too pat to say that if the United States closed all its embassies tomorrow, all the rest of the countries of the world would go back to being what they are, especially the Western countries. This is what the West has become. The West has become.
This is absolutely what the West has become. And let me explain how I see that working, because I want to respond to this charge, right? And this isn't because it does sound like I'm sort of thinking in this kind of optimistic, hopeful, very non-Machiavellian way, and like really a just world fallacy, almost like France should go back to being France, so France will go back to being France. That's not how this shit works at all. And one example of this that I like to give is the example of the Mexican Nazis. I used to work with this guy. The Roberto Bolaño book? What's it called? The one about this fake world where he talks about the right-wing movements in Latin America. In the 30s, although the wild propaganda about Hitler taking over South America was widely overplayed, in the 30s, you saw in all of these Latin American countries, you saw genuine rip-off Hitler movements. People were actually ripping off the Third Reich and getting traction from it. And so there's all these kind of this, and this sort of gets mixed up with the Cristero, history, story of Mexican history, and you have the strange Mexican right that never exists. And the only reason I know about this, the Cristero is a part of history, but the only reason I know about these Sinarquistas is that I worked with a guy who was part of a family that came from one. And what you see there is that essentially you have this, the Cole Porter, you're the top song in which Mussolini is like, you're the top, you're Mussolini. And what you see is that these prestige is basically a result of power and success. And it's just like Osama bin Laden said, when people see a strong horse and a weak horse, they're like the strong horse. And so what you would see going on in all of these countries once Western influence was withdrawn is you would see that for most of history, in let's say Argentina, it was possible for there to be a source of strength that was an essentially national and conservative source of strength that was basically had all of the policies and preferences and beliefs that we associate with Argentinian conservatism. As the power of the U.S. embassy in those countries increased, and it's especially as we deviated from that Westphalian system of government where we said recognition is literally recognition of the de facto power, and turned this into this doctrine of recognition, meaning we like you, we believe in you, we trust you. And we essentially, you know, in the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. diplomacy first asserted its ability to choose who was sovereign over South American countries, Latin American countries. And their first choice was to say, anybody can rule as long as it's not a European monarch. And then they were like, anybody.
Okay, wait. That's not what it said. That's not what it said.
That's not what it said, but that's what it meant. It was an ideological doctrine. It absolutely was an ideological doctrine.
And in fact, no, I disagree. I mean, I'm not saying
this is Britain. This was a Whig doctrine, and it was an anti.
Okay, I'm not saying this to be authoritative. I'm just saying I do teach it a lot. I've taught it recently, which means I've reread it lots lately. Let me tell you what
the New World. Who called the New World into being to redress the balance of the old?
It's precisely a non-ideological doctrine in the following way. There is a debate in U.S. foreign policy from the beginning of the Republic, which says if we have, in the Declaration of Independence, declared ourselves a country based on universal principles, are we then not, or are we obligated to use our foreign policy to help spread those principles? This becomes a thing. Obviously, after the French Revolution, when the American public opinion, or at least elite opinion, divides, do we have to be behind the revolution? First of all, do we favor it or do we not? Second of all, if we favor it, do we have to physically back it? We have to give them money and support in some way, right?
Fucking insane.
And this debate goes on, and it goes on throughout it then becomes about colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. Well, we're a colony. We're a rebellious colony that threw off our colonial shackles and made ourselves into a country. Are we therefore obligated by principle to help all of these other colonies in the Western Hemisphere throw off their shackles? And the answer in the Monroe Doctrine says we are not. We're not. We have no obligation to do it. However, if not only do we have no obligation to do it, we're not going to do it. We're not going to help you. If you manage to do it on your own, we will prevent the Europeans from coming back and recolonizing you. That's what the doctrine says to the Europeans. First of all, you can't set up new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. We'll oppose that. If somebody liberates themselves from you and you try to get them back, we'll oppose that. To the extent that you still have a colony as a going concern, we don't care. As long as you can keep it, you can have it. And as Curtis, as you said, this is a linchpin of the document that makes it non-ideological. We don't care what government you have, right? This is trying to settle this ideological question from the beginning of the founding, in which some were saying the United States of America, in order to be morally pure, should not have dealings with monarchs anywhere because monarchy is itself offensive to our principles of government. We shouldn't talk to them. We shouldn't send ambassadors, no treaties, no nothing, because we find them morally anathema. And obviously it was the Hamiltonian wing or side of elite opinion in those days who said, that's insane. We're going to need to talk to these kings, and what do we care? The Monroe Doctrine tries to settle that by saying, whatever government you put forth, we'll talk to. We're not going to hold you to our moral standard. Okay?
You're doing a couple of things.
It's very non-ideological, and in fact, the cynical interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, last point, the realpolitik interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine is we are using a principle to mask what is the real intention of the Monroe Doctrine, which is to create a buffer hemisphere and keep European empires completely out. But without stating it on realpolitik basis, we just want this half of the globe to ourselves without you coming in and interfering. We have to find a way of saying, no, because these guys have, asserted themselves, their independence, we're supporting their independence. But note, it doesn't say we're going to help them get their independence or anything like that.
Yeah, so
just says we're keeping you out forever.
You're making no offense, but from my perspective, I think you're making a couple of different historical mistakes. One of them is that you're basically taking these documents at face value. You're interpreting the things that they say as their policies. You're basically making the mistake that Burnham points out in the first essay in the Machiavellians. You're looking at the formal meaning rather than the real meaning. The real meaning is
I just told you what I think the real meaning is, which is the creation of a buffer
let me tell you what I think. Let me go from your real
meaning which is a realpolitik.
My real meaning in realpolitik at that time, the United States is not a meaningful power in comparison with Great Britain. The United States at the time is best regarded as a sort of appendage or wing of Great Britain. And certainly this is true in the case of its foreign policy at the time. The foreign policy that is the Monroe Doctrine is essentially foisted on America by its friends in the UK. The purpose of its friends in the UK is to basically combat the Holy Alliance. And the idea of the Holy Alliance, of course, spearheaded by that arch reactionary, the Tsar. What was it? Was it Nicholas I? The idea of Alexander II. I forget the Tsar who sent his army to Paris. And the idea of the Tsar who sent his army to Paris is that he's going to basically stamp out this scourge, this cancer of revolution, this cancer of democracy. He's going to restore the old order exactly the way it was. He's going to restore the old monarchies of Britain and France, and he's going to restore the colonies in the New World to them. And then Britain, who has, of course, fought by their side against this monster Napoleon, but Britain, which is the actual source of this virus, says, no, we're not going to have any revolution. We agree with you about revolution. Revolution is bad. Don't do revolution. But, we want liberty. We want to break the shackles. You're using this like propaganda language from the 18th century, the 19th century. We want to break the shackles of Latin America. So what we're going to say is Lord Canning, who's essentially the opponent of the Holy Alliance, is going to say, you're not going to have America back. And what we're going to do in this clever diplomatic maneuver that is still going to be confusing people 200 fucking years later is we're going to foist this policy on our little friends in America, and we're going to pretend that it's an American policy, even though the only Navy that can possibly enforce it is the British Navy. And that to me is the motto and now we can just agree.
Okay, the United States had defeated Great Britain in a war 11 years before this.
That's what Canning said.
There's a number. We could go on this forever, but let me just a couple of problems with this.
I'm going to go to Michael here. Going to Michael.
Had defeated Great Britain in a war 11 years before. I think it's preposterous to say that the British Navy was more capable. The British Navy, which lost the war of 1812 to the United States, was more capable of intervening in the Western Hemisphere across an ocean than the United States Navy was intervening in its own hemisphere. The whole purpose of the policy of the Monroe Doctrine was to keep European colonial powers out of North America, or to reduce their influence. This is at a time when Britain still had Canada, when the whole Oregon question was still open, and the United States feared
the Venezuela dispute.
Feared British expansion on the West Coast. The United States feared the British might get California, in particular San Francisco and San Francisco Bay.
You're jumping to later in the century.
You have to, no, I'm not jumping to later. This was a fear that was put to rest by the Mexican War when the United States acquired California, and by the resolution of the Oregon dispute in 1840, whatever. And then beyond that, though, you have to look at the track record. The United States doesn't start doing the kinds of things that you're talking about in Latin America until really the Teddy Roosevelt administration, with the invocation of the so-called Roosevelt corollary.
What about the Maximilian?
When we really start intervening directly in these states.
I've got a call on our in my history, essentially. Certainly anti-British sentiment was pronounced, especially among the goddamn Irishmen, for many years in this country.
Of course.
But it was felt when basically the alliance between the Federalists and the Whigs was reestablished. It was felt that there was this essentially one, patrician Whig sort of interconnected order. And it was a great shock to the British establishment when in the Venezuela dispute in the 1870s or 1880s, the Americans were like, oh no, actually we're going to use the Monroe Doctrine against you. And at that point, the British were like, what? Because again, if Lord Canning didn't mean what I said he meant when he said, I've called the New World into an existence to redress the balance of the old, what did he mean? If you compare the powers of the U.S., the idea that the War of 1812 was a defeat of Britain, it was like Britain sent a couple of tiny expeditions over there. It doesn't measure the relative.
Okay, I'm not saying it was a defeat on the order of Berlin, 1945, but it was a defeat. And I still
lost a couple of battles, and then
this is probably them in the irritating to Jack and to his audience that we could go on.
Let's have a moratorium on the 19th century. We're not going to discuss the 19th century anymore. Jack, you're a moderator. Save us from the 19th and
Hey,
you're God's 18th.
Well, just save us from the Monroe Doctrine.
My area of focus in grad school was Latin America, so you start talking Monroe Doctrine and my ears perk up. So I'm listening and enjoying all of it. I mean, guys, we could continue down this road. I'm not sure where you want to go. I've got a few questions that I'd like to get to. We're already an hour and a half in. I got two more. Usually these panel shows are only 60 minutes. I had a feeling that you guys would have a few things to say to each other. I feel a little bit like a bull rider at the rodeo right now, and I'm just trying to get my 8 seconds on here. But I appreciate all the dialogue and such. I'm going to change directions just a little bit. I've been thinking, I talked to Christopher Caldwell about his book, Age of Entitlement. I read The Stakes. Curtis, I've been reading your work and all of you guys for some time. And this feeling that I'm getting right now about the immigration situation in the United States, we're changing gears altogether here. According to the proponents of Hart-Celler at the time, the demographics in the United States were not meant to change if the implementation of the Immigration Act. But yet all of a sudden we can now look at the demographic makeup of the United States and see that what was once 85 to 90% white is now on its way to being a mere plurality. And if you look back at this moment in time where Hart-Celler, they say, hey, this is not the intention. This is not the expectation. And we don't think that this is going to happen. I'm waking up in 2021 looking around and asking myself, am I living in a mistake or a lie? What do you think? And is there anything that can be done, or is this the genie that's out of the bottle and here we are today? Curtis? Michael? Who do you want to start? Michael, go for it.
I think I'm mistake or lie. I don't know. I've looked into this a lot and I've never been able to find a definitive answer. I tend toward lie though, based on all I've learned about our ruling class over the last 50 years. And then your question, well, what can be done about it? Well, I don't know that the 2020 defeat was catastrophic in that sense. I mean, Trump's record wasn't tremendous, but he was the first president to try to do something about immigration. And by the way, by not tremendous, some of that's Trump's fault. Okay. I think there are certain things he tried to do that he couldn't get done because of deep state opposition, but then he would shoot himself in the foot by saying like, oh, we want to triple legal immigration or whatever, which I think A, is bad policy, but B, was also definitely not what his base wanted or wanted to hear. So, a combination of his own mistakes and entrenched opposition made his 4-year record less fulsome than it otherwise could have been on this question. We still would have been better off had he gotten a second term and been able to build more wall, do more reform. We know that what we have now in office in Washington are complete open borders absolutists. And I think we're going to see really, really massive and rapid demographic change in this country over the next 4 years. And really, over the next however many years. I don't expect a Republican president ever to be elected again. And I don't expect an immigration restrictionist ever to be elected again. So the United States is going to be, unless people just decide they no longer want to come here because we look so stupid or we're so dysfunctional. Matt Iglesias's alarming and I wish preposterous book title, 1 Billion Americans, suddenly becomes plausible given the way the ruling class is now and what it wants and the entrenched power that it has. I have a feeling, and I know other people have it. It's like, if we're living in a mistake or a lie, isn't that a problem? Like, Curtis would say no. He would just say, that's part of the plan. I think it's a problem. I think a friend of mine put it this way. Let me just one last thing. My friend of mine put it this way, and this is one of these things that, I'll believe it when I see it or may not happen. But I have said for a while, and others have said, and I believe that one of the fundamental, there are 3 fundamental purposes to mass immigration for the ruling class, right? One is cheap labor, keep labor costs down and goose business profits. Maybe there's 4. Another is just the larger the population, the larger the consumer market. And you could say, well, that would exist no matter where certain people are. Well, it isn't if their incomes are X in country of origin, but they become X plus Y once they're in the United States, then they make better consumers. The third reason is expiation of guilt. America and the entire West have come to believe themselves fundamentally guilty societies that owe the rest of the world access to their soil, their markets, their labor markets, their housing markets, and so on and so forth. We have no moral right to restrict immigration at all. This has become elite conventional wisdom, left-wing conventional wisdom. And then the fourth reason is simply votes, right? Any place that tips, the immigrants tip population-wise, votes Democratic forever, or votes left of center. It doesn't matter which country you're talking about. Votes left of center forever. So
didn't 2020 refute that assertion? No. Border counties in Texas, Dade County in Florida.
We saw for the first time some drift in the Rio Grande Valley and in certain parts, a shift toward the red, but it's nothing like majorities for Republicans or for Trump. Now, if that trend were to continue, I'd be delighted. Am I expecting it? No, not necessarily. I suppose this would be that sort of, this is either an anomaly that disproves the prior 50 years or post 65, the entirety. If let me put it this way, if that trend that we saw is the beginning of something new, then it's a reversal of the 55 years, consistent 55 years of voting patterns since Hart-Celler in every state, at every level, the municipal level, at the state level, and the national level. Maybe something big has finally happened to change it. I don't know. But
I think something big has happened. I think, and we touched on it earlier when we were discussing the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America and the types of people in Latin America, the Peninsulares, the Conquistadores, whatever. These people aren't woke.
If so, we do know that the one way that the United States political system stabilized, for instance, in the 20th century, was by the lockdown, the restrictionism, and people think it starts in the 20s because that's when the bill passed. 1923 and then 24, but it really starts in 1914 with the end, essentially, of transatlantic shipping and the steerage boats because of World War I. So the United States doesn't have effectively lots of immigration from 1914 until the 80s, because Hart-Celler passes in 65. It's still a trickle up into the 70s. It really starts to become a large numbers in the 80s. My point, though, is this. This is what my friend said to me. He says, there will come a point, if this continues, where that 40 or 50% of the country that I talked about, you want to call them Trump voters, call them whatever you want, deplorables, flyover people, realize that they are now, that immigration has so gamed the political system that they're locked out forever. They can vote and it doesn't matter. It's like voting, what the left would like is to make national votes like voting statewide in California or New York. Republicans are there, they exist, they live there, they can go and vote in the polls, and it absolutely doesn't matter. If you get to a point where there's a significant number, tens of millions, 100 million people who realize I am in this nominal democracy, I am technically allowed to vote, but my vote doesn't matter. The system has been completely gamed to make sure that I no longer have a voice. I think that fundamentally destabilizes the system in a way that will have unforeseen consequences.
Okay, there you go again. You're attributing weakness to sort of conflating weakness with illegitimacy. I don't think it destabilizes the system at all. I think that actually the normal, if you look across history, the normal position of most people is complete political apathy and complete knowledge that they're completely incapable of changing the powers that rule over them. And if you look at, one of the things, I forget, I was reading this in Sallust or maybe Sallust, the last elections that were held in the Roman Empire, because of course Augustus doesn't say, "Oh, the Republic is over, I'm starting the empire." He's not like Palpatine. He's like, "Oh, we've restored order and stabilized institutions, and I'm the first citizen." That's it. And actually, the last person who tries to organize actual Roman-style Republican elections in the imperial period is none other than Caligula. And of course, because it's Caligula, star of the famous Bob Guccione movie, it's a shit show. It's a complete shit show. No one takes it seriously. It's a complete joke. It's like student government. And so, the reality is, and, having lived for a number of years in California, I've seen this happen. It all simply turns into student government. It doesn't matter at all. No one has any sort of, they have this very mild relationship to it. I was just reading a piece that was about, I think the title, it was linked on Hacker News, and I think the title was, "How Did You Democracy in a One-Party State?" And they interviewed a bunch of Japanese voters, and they're like, how do they choose who you vote for, given that, your government never changes? And they're like, "Oh, I follow this very carefully, and I vote for," they sort of follow all these kind of cargo cult rituals as though, they mattered. They treat it more and more like a sports game, and in fact, it doesn't matter. And so, that's I think that when you say, "Oh, disenfranchising all of these people will naturally lead them to, revolt.
No. I did not say it will naturally lead them to that. I said it could.
No, but
okay. Curtis,
another
difference between you and I is you seem to have a static view of the so-called common people, that they're always the same in all times and places. Mostly they are, I would say, apathetic and apolitical.
No. I think the modern
wait a minute. Let me look at it. The character of the American people is a 250-year tradition of rather spirited defense of liberty and a belief, however potentially misguided at times, that they have some say over the direction of their government. It is possible, it may not come to pass, we may be so corrupted and so degraded and so apathetic at this point that we will let the transition to empire pass unremarked and unlamented. But it is possible that when people finally realize, like, my vote doesn't matter anymore, this whole thing is rigged and is a game, there will be a reaction. Not guaranteed. It is possible.
What should they do?
As to the California example, that suffers from the same problem, or at least the same potential drawback as the Brazil analogy. California can only be California because it is backdropped by federal power. It is backdropped, in a sense, by red resources, and whatever residuals of red virtue are left both in the state and in the rest of the United States. If we could saw off California and make it an island, as the way the original Spanish explorers thought it was in the 15th and 16th centuries, if we could first get my immediate family out of there, but I would be all for that experiment, and I guarantee you that place would not be able to govern itself in any kind of sustainable way for more than 10 years, probably less than that.
Well, not the way it does, certainly. I mean, I don't think we disagree at a certain level. I think there's a lot of, and you can see that when I talked about what would happen. I mean, is California so different from France, right? What happens in France if you pull it outside?
It's stupid.
That's a different question. That's it's a different question, because there is still a French tradition. I think that, the relationship between us and our ancestors 250 years ago is wildly overstated. I think if those people met us, they would be horrified and disgusted, and they'd probably assume that the only leader for us is the king. So why we take their, if they themselves would prescribe monarchy for us, why we continue to refer to them and prescribing republicanism for ourselves is rather beyond me.
I'm not prescribing republicanism for us. I say with my teacher, mentor, and literary hero and philosophic guide Machiavelli, that all things being equal, I prefer republics to monarchies. I absolutely realize that republics are not always possible, and this may be one of those times, or we may be shortly coming to a time when republicanism will not be possible.
We have long since passed the time when republicanism was not possible, in my opinion, many, many years ago, and many before our parents were born. And, so I'm certainly not disagreeing with you on that subject. I think that it's just sort of, in a way, the darker your black pill gets, the less dramatic it is. It's like, the great forgotten American conservative of the 30s, who was a liberal of the 20s, named Garrett. His name was actually Garrett. Wrote this essay which you'll find reprinted at Mises.org, called "The Revolution Was." And he's sort of pointing out with some irritation to people that, they're always sort of, one of the things you see conservatives always indulging in, probably not entirely for fundraising purposes, is this idea that you're at the decision point. Every point in history, if you read conservative writing going back throughout the 20th century, is always the decision point. It's always really important to send funds now because we could go either way and things have not yet been decided. And, my view is that things were decided, a very long time ago. And you're looking at an essentially revolutionary regime, which has these repeated revolutions that restore it. The last one being in the 30s with FDR. And all I'm calling for really in the American tradition is a new FDR to turn Washington into a startup government, which is exactly what FDR did there. So, to me, that's a very reasonable bluish red or whatever kind of, traditional thing, where you basically say, here's our beautiful Constitution. It's beautifully adapted to all three forms of government, in a sense, because it was meant to encapsulate all of those. And it doesn't really state the priorities between them. Well, we've had a long run of oligarchy in which basically, sort of pseudo-legal governance, is what happens. You could just as easily, reading that piece of parchment, say, The president is in charge of the executive branch, and it's his job to follow the law, and it's his choice as to what the law is. He's sovereign. You could basically view it as a point of elective sovereignty. And viewing the presidency as fully sovereign, which is not quite what FDR did, although it's what he said he would do in his inaugural speech, which I recommend everybody read, especially the last 10 paragraphs. They're absolutely wonderful. And, but it's sort of fairly close to what he did. He really took control of Washington as an individual. And anything that was left of the Lincoln version of the U.S. government was pretty much wiped out with FDR. Anything that was left of the Washington, U.S. government was pretty much wiped out with Lincoln. Sorry, wrong century. We're not going there. But the point is that
just for the record, I disagree with all of that. I mean, I more agree with his take on FDR. I'm actually pretty sympathetic with his take on Lincoln, though. That's an unbridgeable divide.
Fine. An unbridgeable divide. But
it also, in a sense, wait, this is important. It also, in a sense, doesn't matter. One of the things I do appreciate about Curtis is I have been mostly in print, but occasionally personally, I went to the Claremont Graduate School. I studied with Harry Jaffa, the greatest interpreter of Lincoln of the 20th, perhaps of all time. Therefore, I'm a partisan of Lincoln, a fan of Lincoln, and so on. I have met more than one, let us say, Southern paleocon type who hates Lincoln, who agrees with me and with Curtis and probably with you, Jack, and with lots of other people about whatever the present crisis is, almost in toto. 98.9, remember it was Ivory, the soap, 99.7, 99, whatever. We're just that close. The disagreement over Lincoln is so important to these people that they would rather just shoot me dead on the spot and then get rolled over by a woke tank than take an anti-tank weapon from me or join with me to shoot the tank. It's that important.
Well,
even if the tank is 1 millimeter away from killing them. And Curtis,
I can't speak to Michael. I can't speak to Michael on this. I can't speak to Michael on this. But if you're what I would call, obviously, I'm not no Southern heritage whatsoever. But if you're what I would call Lincoln curious, what I would recommend reading two books. One of them is Harry Jaffa's Crisis of the House Divided, which is, and the other is Edgar Lee Masters' Lincoln the Man. And you can compare, one of those presents Lincoln as a philosopher, and the other one presents him as a politician. And if you read both of those books and you come back to me and you say, no, this is a philosopher, not a politician, we'll be forced to agree to disagree. But that's where I stand on Lincoln. All right, let's pull out of that century. Immigration. Can I say my bit on immigration?
Yes, please.
Because I mostly agree with Michael on this. I think there's a couple of points of relatively subtle disagreement. I think that when you to go back and understand the thinking of Hart-Celler, which is definitely a prevarication. I think there's even an interview with Celler where he kind of winks about it. But if you go back to the origin of that thinking, it goes back to the settlement houses. It goes back to this engagement of the American upper class with these steerage passengers. And what they discovered with these steerage passengers was that it was very easy to turn them into Americans, basically because they were mostly Jews. And Jews, they discovered, made really great Americans, could be Americanized very effectively. And they were also, as some racist writer I read once put it, there was a fire on a melting pot, and the fire was racism. And one of the ways in which you can tell, sort of the extent to which that fire is actually operating is that when those steerage passengers, like my ancestors, came over in the 20s and 30s, they changed their first names. They didn't anglicize their last names. Sometimes they did, but their first names almost always. So my grandfather was, Nechaim, which he turned into Norman, which was a nice, very Anglo upper crusty kind of sounding name. That's why you have a lot of Irvings and Sydneys and so forth in that generation of Jews. They were doing everything possible to assimilate, and they focused on like a laser on the values of the highest social class in America, which is why they became communists. And or it's certainly why my ancestors became communists. And so that sort of experience sort of soaked deep into the cultural memory of those classes. So when you say, was Hart-Celler a lie or a mistake? I would say it was a lie and a mistake. It was a lie in that they were simply lying that they didn't intend to perform those demographic changes. But it was a mistake in that their expectation was that they would take these people and make them better Americans than the Americans they already had to deal with. And that was very much the belief of the time. They were not trying to create a slave empire. They were not trying to basically create a world in which there was kind of a permanent sort of distance between the sort of upper PMC upper class and the people who did their lawns and, washed and cleaned their bathrooms. And so their intention of sort of doing this very Southern slaveholder-like thing of importing cheap labor. And let's not forget that most Southern slaveholders loved their slaves too. They were very it was a very paternal, in the ideal at least, it was a very paternal relationship. So that actually becomes very similar to the Malibu, Hollywood person and, her housekeeper, right? And which is it's a disturbing and creepy thought, because really what you have, this is not an equal relationship. And so you have these people behaving like Roman aristocrats, driving out their virtuous peasants and replacing them with these kind of slave armies. And the feeling in their minds is that they're doing this very holy thing. They believe that these people are theirs. They're part of this sort of world, kind of unified world. Why should it make a difference what the GPS coordinates of where your mother squeezed you out were? It shouldn't. Why should it make a difference what race your mother was? Obviously it shouldn't. And so according to their values, literally the value of no human being is illegal. And when you catch one of these people that is kind of an immigration moderate, ask them to justify their belief in the sacred power of GPS coordinates. They can't. And so eventually this is kind of this immigration thing, although it's really as a vote importing scheme at a Machiavellian level, also represents this kind of very kind of deep spiritual aristocratic value that these people have, and they're very sincere in those values.
And
Michael,
let's not forget that the Hart-Celler is 1965, so 1 year after the Civil Rights Act, the same year as the Voting Rights Act, and this great wave of liberalizing legislation, which was in a sense 20 years, at a minimum 20 years in the making. In fact, you can go all the way back to so immigration effectively is cut off by World War I, and then is cut off or greatly reduced in law in 23, 24 with a couple of different laws signed by Calvin Coolidge. And elite America begins almost immediately, not quite immediately, but soon thereafter, to develop a guilt complex over this. We're discriminating and this is bad. That accelerates in the 30s when it's really, as it becomes clearer, especially what the Nazi regime is doing, and America is being less generous in taking refugees than some elites think it should be. That increases the guilt complex. Further thing that increases the guilt complex, and I'm not saying these are unjustified guilt complex. America actually had some
being
things
actually
to be
guilty. I was like being actually guilty. Really,
some of it, right? So you can't disaggregate this too from the effect that the segregation of the armed forces during World War II had on America's moral psyche, in a sense. People, this civil rights activists use this to great effect. They would say, "Oh, so we're fighting a fascist regime that ranks human beings by a hierarchy according to race, and we're doing that with the segregated armed forces. How does that not make us hypocrites?" It's to the point where 2 years after the war, Truman desegregates the armed forces, but it's still 20 years before you start getting this legislation. My point is that by the time you get this legislation, there's a sense that any kind of discrimination in any kind is bad, and discrimination also includes saying you can come to the U.S. and you can't. I forgot the exact quote. It's in my book.
Sure.
But Robert Kennedy, who was a senator at the time of the passage, remember Robert Kennedy is elected to the Senate from New York in 1964, says something to the effect of immigration to the United States is civil rights for foreigners. They have a right to come into the West, and we don't have a right to say no, because that is a bad and evil discrimination against their humanity. And that thought, which goes all the way back now, nearly 60 years ago, I would say is completely unquestioned by today's elites, and has been for at least the past 20 or 30 years, that not just for the USA, but for any first world Western country, or for Japan for that matter, any country that kind of has it good, has it good in terms of infrastructure, safety, incomes, all these kinds of things. You can't say no, because you only have what you have for some kind of immoral reason, and inequality and differentials are bad. Therefore, you got to let them in, or you're being immoral. That's the presupposition.
That represents, I would take that in a slightly different direction at the end of that. I agree with almost all of it. I would say that the presupposition there is essentially this feeling that we own the world. and that the distinction between, therefore, the American government is responsible for the whole world and all of the people in it. And that assumption has been essentially unquestioned since we, in fact, conquered the world with our good friend Stalin, back some time ago. I want to always, when people blame these ideas on the 60s, there's, I don't know if I've gotten you to do this, Michael Anton, but I recommend it to almost anyone. There's this wonderful little film called Hitler Lives. It was made, have I made you watch this? It was made in 1945, the summer of 45. The director of this film is Don Siegel, who later directed Dirty Harry. The script, it's cut down from a film by Frank Capra. It's cut down from a film by Frank Capra called Your Job in Germany, cut down to about 17 minutes. And the script, although he's not credited on there, is actually basically by Dr. Seuss. So this is, again, Dr. Seuss scripted documentary about Nazism from 1945, after, of course, the defeat of Nazism. It's a completely deranged film, and it's wonderful because it reminds you of just the insanity of the sort of public discourse at the market level at that time. The gist of the film is that World War II was essentially a race war against the eternal German. And we need to watch this eternal German in case he comes back. Jews are not mentioned once in this film. Hitler is an equal opportunity baby killer. Moreover, after we defeat the spirit of German militarism abroad, we must come back and defeat it at home and defeat American populism, literally. So this association between the victory abroad and the victory at home, it sort of makes sense that your ideological opponents are most secure at home. It's like, we really understate the extent to which World War II was a revolutionary war and was conceived by those in charge of the war as a fundamentally revolutionary project. You talked about Dean Acheson and his fighting the war against communism. I mean, Dean Acheson was, the leader of the pro-Russia faction in the State Department during the war. He breaks with Russia, not because he's ideologically opposed to communism, but because he realizes Russia is actually a peer and actually won't work for him. This dream of sort of democratic.
I think that's very this could get into another rabbit. I think that's pretty uncharitable to Acheson on both counts. I admit, you've probably read more than I have on that. I did read his memoirs. I've read a lot of this stuff. To me, it was two
Adolf
ones.
Burley who described him.
The villains of that.
Adolf Burley who described him as the leader of the pro-Russia group in the State Department.
The villains of that, I would say, are more Avril Harriman, who was a dupe, and Kennan, who was mischievous about it. And Acheson seems to me superior to both of them on that count. But that could be,
I think that
another weird rabbit hole that we don't need to go down into.
We could certainly talk about the his case for now. In any case, when you push these things, when you and Christopher Caldwell push these things back to the 60s, I'm like, that's great, that's amazing. When Christopher Caldwell identifies the Civil Rights Act of 1965 as the cause of woke tyranny in 2021, that's a very brave and daring thing. But those ideologies didn't come from 1965. They didn't even come from 1935. That chain really goes all the way back to the founding, and that's the thing that people.
I agree. I didn't try to push it back to the 60s. I think I pretty specifically said, and there is a tape, that it comes to fruition in the 60s. But I started to go back further. It's not now. This you and I will definitely disagree with. We are not living through. Someday I tried to write this out in my book. I didn't write it out at great enough length, and it's so philosophic it'll be abstruse and interesting to maybe 10 or 20 readers. Someday I do hope to write a considered defense of the founding that explains why the 1776, neither 1776 nor 1787 nor 1865 gets you 2021. And I'm not going to write that so much as to say, because we can all, Curtis, so please don't straw man me with this. Anton, he still believes we can go back to 1776 tomorrow. I'm well aware that we can't, right? I do think, though, that if someday, I think I said something like this in my book, right? If the woke society collapses tomorrow, North America will still be here. There will still be people living on it. They will have to organize themselves somehow. And like the good student of political philosophy I am, I both realize that they will not be able to, no political society can perfectly mirror rationality, exactly the way the ancients thought. You can't, the philosophers can figure out the best regime that can never make people live according to it. But the closer you can get to it, the better it will be. And not beginning with mistakes such as 1776 leads you to woke fascism, I think will be helpful, because I think that is wrong.
I'm gonna jump in here. I'm gonna jump in here a little bit. We're up at 2 hours. I have one last set of questions that I'd like us to get to. I do want to comment, you guys, your historical knowledge, philosophical knowledge, the context you're able to put this all in, truly inspirational and amazing. I know that the listeners, and myself included, are getting quite an education. I have been studying Rome myself. I've been watching like a 30 lecture series. I'm like 2/3 of the way through. So, Curtis, I caught your Pergamon reference in a recent piece, and I was like, oh, I know exactly what he's talking about, where he bequeaths his lands to Rome upon his death. I don't think you look very favorably upon that move. But it's really just been a great thing for me to watch, and I know the listeners are really getting a ton out of this. The last question is a two-parter for you guys. One is, a lot of this is very theoretical, very high, very top level. What would you do if you had a magic wand right now? What would you do? How would you rearrange the world? What would everything look like in your intellectual framework and historical context and such? And then the follow-up to that is what do you tell all of the guys that are listening right now, who are listening because they feel like there's something wrong and they feel like they want to do something? Like, what can people do on an individual level today?
Can I take the second half of that first?
You can take either way, either one of those in either direction, but I would like to hear both of your perspectives on both of those things. So let's start there.
The first thing I would say, and I now I'm old. I think Curtis and I are about the same age. So I'm 51, and I do sense from what I read and what I talk to is young people, they really do want to do something. And they look askance. They're young people are more spirited, more thumotic than older people, middle-aged people, whatever it is that I am. And they look askance at people who are a bit cautious and hang back. So my first piece of advice is, don't just do something for the sake of doing something. In other words, don't charge machine gun nests that are going to drop you before you get anywhere close to having any kind of a real impact. That is foolish. It is very brave. You will not have accomplished anything. And you'll be dead, and you won't be around to make any of the kind of change that you want to see coming. And so, to these young people who are impatient, who with some justice, who really don't like the situation that their society, their country, their lives are in right now, with much justification, right? And they want to be involved, but they want to be, they want to be active and they want to be forceful. Charging regime strongholds when you're pretty certain that you're going to get killed or canceled or made unemployable or whatever is not the way to go about it. It will get you plaudits from some quarters. It'll get you street cred. It will get you authenticity, but it won't be good. You have decades to live, probably. The people who are in this with you and who would like to see serious reform could use you, not dead and not canceled. It would be nice if you had some children to contribute to a coming renewal, if that were to ever come. So don't do things like that. And I sense that pent up energy often, and then a kind of counterclaim that, well, if you refrain, any hint of caution is cowardice. Reread Thucydides' book 3 on Corcyra. There's a very, very famous passage where he talks about how bad things got in Corcyra, and I can't quote it from memory, but it's something to the effect of, all of these things previously thought of as virtues, such as prudence, such as caution, such as loyalty, became seen as horrible vices. So refraining from murder was seen as pusillanimity. In this, read it's a fantastic paragraph. I could pull it off the shelf and read it to you, but we don't have time. Don't fall for that kind of thing. You'll just destroy your life and you won't do any good. There are things that you can do, building communities, first of all, make yourself as good as you can be. Get healthy, eat better, exercise, learn stuff, read good books, cut out the junk, learn as much of what is going on around you in the political sense, just as much as you need to function, but otherwise don't consume mass media garbage anymore. Focus on stuff that will really matter. You don't want to be so much of a hermit that you can't even name the president, right? You got to know the basics, but don't spend your days poring over the newspapers and consuming cable news and that kind of thing. That's not worth it. Know just as much as you need to get by, and build up your friend network. Try to be as I hate these kinds of buzz phrases, but I can't think of anything better at the moment. Try to be as anti-fragile as possible. I would caution younger people, don't go into work for big corporations anymore, because you're selling your soul, and they will increasingly demand fealty on ideological levels that you shouldn't want to give yourself over to. See if you can't learn trades, start your own businesses in networks that make it hard for the state, broadly understood, and for the regime to come after you and take away your livelihood. For now, you're just hitting singles, and you're hitting singles in your own little single A ballpark. The time to dream big about hitting home runs in the majors and, establishing either, Purple Caesar in Curtis's terms, if you're 25 and building your life, I wouldn't be thinking about that right now. To the extent that you want to get in politics, start at the lowest possible level and work your way up. Organize your own neighborhoods, your own communities, your towns, your villages, building out to the city, the county, and the state. And I would vote in federal elections, I suppose, if you're in a state where your vote matters, but I wouldn't put a lot of my money, time, energy, or thought onto the feds. I think they are not amenable to the kind of reform or change that we would like to see. But I think these lower level governments that are closer to you, where you live and where you work, are, and I would focus my energies there for now.
Great advice on the individual level. That? Yeah, go for it, Curtis.
Can I echo that before? Well, I agree with at least 97% of what Michael said there, and I just want to echo the advice of don't just do something, stand there, which is always by far the best dissident advice. I recall some story of a Soviet, or I think Polish citizen. I think this was Alexander Vaught. He's deported to the Gulag, and in his train going to the Gulag, all of the people who are in the train car have been deported for the same reason. At least they're under the same charge, and the charge is organizing an anti-Soviet conspiracy. And they're talking to each other, and eventually they find one guy on the train who did organize an anti-Soviet conspiracy. And it was this 17-year-old kid, and his anti-Soviet conspiracy was like him and his two friends in high school, right? and they're just like, my God, you're such an idiot. And of course, the last thing that you want to do is organize anything like an anti-Soviet conspiracy. And I think even more so, the idea of an anti-Soviet conspiracy within the Soviet Union all came out of the mythos of the Soviets themselves. It was a Soviet myth, this myth of revolution. It's a Western myth, of course, too. And so, when you think about this revolution, it has this kind of accepted narrative, this accepted, here's how you're a hero. You speak up, you fight back, you perform acts of civil disobedience. Maybe you're a real tough guy and you perform acts of military disobedience. You have a guerrilla war. This is all very American. This is the great American tradition, right? And it's the revolutionary tradition. And one of the things, when you get into real history and you're like, oh, actually, none of this stuff really actually happened the way they say it happened, you start to realize that should teach you that you can't re-inhabit these stories. And one of the things that constantly is happening on the right is that people are sort of trying to flip these narratives around and kind of re-inhabit these stories in the other direction. And so, they'll be like, oh, why not have, civil rights for us or whatever, and, or, Marxism for us. And it simply doesn't work. It's not sort of part of the natural structure of these things. The natural structure of these things is that when you have a regime like this and it falls, it generally falls basically in one step, especially when it's the center of the world like this. And so that step is nowhere near happening anytime soon. It can't happen anytime soon. And so your existence within the system has to be sort of purely personal. The one way I would disagree with what Michael said is I would say, if you feel that it's necessary for you as a person, you as an aristocrat, really, to have a political voice and political leadership and political meaning, don't do it IRL at all. Don't do it under your real name. Be completely anonymous and have completely excellent and awesome OPSEC. And if you don't know what that means, Google it and follow the directions.
Yeah, and, my one caution there, which I understand why Curtis says that, is when people don't write, and I wrote anonymously. It was not for long. It was for several. It was for one part of 1 year in 2016. I was outed. I was lucky in the sense that I always expected to be outed, and I wasn't afraid of it. I just needed. For me, it was time limited. I need to get to date X, and once I get there, I don't care anymore. And I got there by the skin of my teeth. What I've noticed though is that a lot of people who once Curtis, once he adds the qualifier have excellent OPSEC, that he may think that obviates all of this. Excellent OPSEC is definitely better than non-excellent OPSEC. But what I've noticed is people who do this pseudonymously, some of them eventually, they will get doxxed. They will have said things that are a problem for them that they probably wouldn't have said had they not been pseudonymous. There's no guarantee that whatever you do anonymously or pseudonymously won't eventually come get you. Maybe it won't, maybe it will. I've seen people go through it. It can be painful and they can lose a lot. If you don't do it that way, you're foregoing certain things. There are certain things you won't be able to say, certain arguments you won't be able to make, or just, certain interlocutors you can't engage with. Even though you're going to make an argument that's well within the Overton window, you can't talk because, people are going to, I'm sure they've done it before. They'll do it again. They'll be like, we always knew Anton was terrible. He talks to Curtis Yarvin. Well, okay, fine. I'll weather that storm. I don't give a damn. But just, there is no perfect OPSEC, and so if you go down that route,
Mike was right about that.
Yep. You gotta be prepared. Every once in a while, people will say, I'll have friends say, you were really cutting edge, or not, I don't know, cutting edge, but whatever. But like when I was writing pseudonymously, they just thought there was some verve to it. Why don't you do that again? And I just go, I feel almost blessed, lucky that I got away with it once. I'm not going to do it again. But I also know that I do sort of have the peace of mind that every word I've put out there since then and will until I die will be something that's got my name on it that I can own. And if somebody wants to say, you said this, how dare you? I'm going to go, yeah, I said it. Bring it, There have been attempted cancellations on me since I came out initially, since I was exposed initially in early 2017, and so far they've all failed. And I'd like to believe that they're going to fail forever. I'm somewhat hard to cancel, and if I were canceled, I'd probably I'd be okay. But I'd be really cautionary about advising somebody who's 20 or 25 to take that route, because there could be. You could end up in a cul-de-sac.
That's a great caveat.
Before you respond to that, Curvis, I just want to point out, hey, I tried to do the same thing. I tried to use a fake name that wasn't exactly a fake name. I tried to pick a name that was going to blend into the environment. It didn't work. My OPSEC was terrible. Obviously, I have the worst OPSEC in the history of OPSEC. I ended up getting doxxed. I ended up getting canceled. I'll tell you now, it's liberating. It's freeing. I can't be canceled. I'm stronger than I ever was times 100. And on my way to getting, amassing even more influence. One caution to people out there considering writing under pen names or whatnot: eventually, all information will be known. There is just no security at the end of the day. And, the sooner that you can arrange your life in such a way that whether or not people know what you said or didn't say doesn't have an impact on you, I strongly urge people to do that. It's easier said than done, but relying on the cover of a fake name, I don't think is strong enough for the future. Curtis?
Yeah, I don't really have any strong responses to that, to be honest. I think those are both great caveats. And, it's more like, I guess my only difference would be, compared to most people, I think fewer people should be talking. And so, when you have that intense need, that's a real, that's sort of a real calling in a sense, that's a little bit different. But yeah, it's a terrible thing to carry around, and you shouldn't believe in any sort of myths. I think one of the things that, if I've heard, well, it's a free country, isn't it? From people facing some, unbelievable.
No, it's not.
I thought this was America.
And also one I don't like to hear is they can do it, so why can't we do it? No, I don't want to hear that either.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I hear that so much. I hear that so much from the idiot conservatives. Right? Oh, the liberals should be worried about cancel culture because, it'll come around to bite them. And I go, have you been asleep for 50 years? The liberals have, the modern left, the corporate oligarchy, the intellectual corporate oligarchy, however we want to define it, has taken double standardism to just heights never before seen in the world, right? They have absolutely no compunction about destroying you for a sin 1/100th the magnitude of something that they
And
did
they're
just the
sincere
other
about
day.
it. This is, some of them are cynical, I don't doubt. But, in general, you find there is a vast reserve of sincerity. And that's, as you mentioned earlier, one of the big differences between us and late stage Eastern Europe. And that's why I'm convinced that, it really takes another generation before anything
And
can
while
happen.
we're on
But
the subject
go ahead,
of
could
writing,
be wrong.
while we're on the subject of writing, I could say from my own perspective, I went off to grad school with the intention of becoming an academic, which I eventually became, but after a 25-year pause or something like that. I don't know. It was a while. And I learned, I'm a Straussian, a follower of Leo Strauss, who we don't have to go down that rabbit hole in particular in all the disputes. But one of the things that Strauss is very famous for is reviving the awareness of the practice of so-called esoteric writing. Right? He calls it writing between the lines, right? So it says one thing on the surface, but if you read it really carefully, right, he was much ridiculed and criticized for this. I think he proved his point. If one wants to learn, if one wants to read a book that is simply proving the case, using quotes and trying to make it beyond a shadow of a doubt, I highly recommend Philosophy Between the Lines by Arthur Meltzer, which came out, I don't know, 2014, 2015. It's up back there somewhere. I learned that as an academic exercise without thinking I would ever need it to practice it. And then I practiced it because I wrote a sort of, I was going to say it's a joke book. It's not entirely a joke book. I mean, I'm wearing a long sleeve t-shirt right now, but I was a corporate drone for years and I used to wear suits and ties every day.
I have your book. I have this book.
I got very into suits and ties and I wrote a book about suits and ties based on the Prince, Machiavelli's Prince, in which I decided for my own amusement to use Machiavelli's esoteric techniques to the extent that I understood them in the book, counting paragraphs, counting words, inapt, I don't want to go into it, but there's so many things that he does to trick the reader if you're paying attention. And I did that as an intellectual exercise. Now, no one has ever gone through my book and found any of it, and nor will they, because they just won't. No one is going to care. That in and of itself, even though I only did it as a kind of
I did not notice anything in the book.
Puzzle creation, puzzle solving, turns out to be very useful later in life. First having learned it in grad school, then practiced it. So if you really want to, get a little bit, if you want to say some things that you don't want to say, learn how to do that. That's my long-winded way.
This was actually going to be a question that I was going to ask you about, Michael, moving forward with the censorship and the algorithms and people reading and the computers reading your stuff. We're going to have to learn again how to say what you want to say by saying something else. And I think that might be where some of the safety lies. I'd like to get to our final question. If you had a magic wand, what would you do? What would the world look like? You could just snap your fingers and make changes. If there was one thing that you wish that the right would just accept and take to heart right now, what would you do? What would you say? This is your chance just to sort of paint a little what if scenario, and let's use this as a way to carry it out.
To me, it's a very hard question. Because,
Michael, why don't you go first?
Well, I don't have much to say, so let me just do this quickly. It's a really hard question because, again, going back to my old pal, Nick, he has a sort of love-hate analysis of the cycle. The one benefit of if you wave a magic wand, if there is perfection, if there is the nirvana utopian state, how do you avoid that? How do you prevent that from becoming a kind of pasture filled with last men in which the human spirit is gone? There's got to be trouble. There's got to be trial and tribulation. There has to be ups and downs for humanity to be fully itself. For humanity, a stage in which humanity to act. So I don't know that I'd want to, if there really is a classical best regime, I could pick up the wand and wave it and create it, and that means stasis forever for humanity. I don't think I would wave it. I think humanity, I think we need to have our ups and downs and our trials and our tribulations, or we're not really human anymore.
Excellent point. How about something a little bit more practical? Well, enjoy the struggle is what you're saying. Life is struggle. More practical point. What today, right now, would you wish the larger right side of politics could accept right now?
Well, I mean, if you mean the professional right, I wish they could just accept their own obsolescence and go away. In terms of waving the wand, getting back to a dispute Curtis and I had about whether there's any residual spiritedness or, jealous guarding of liberty, all of that language that the founders used about the American people. I'd either like to wave the wand in order to wake it from its slumber, if it's just there and asleep, Or if it's gone, restore it. That's what I would do. And I don't know which it is, but I do know that it's not exact. I mean, there are signs of life, there are signs of it, but not enough. I'd like to see some more. So that's what I think I would do.
Thank you, Michael. Curtis?
Well, there's a couple things I want to respond to that comment about the last men for a moment, but I think the immediate question of what Americans should realize, especially Americans of a non-Kool-Aid drinking persuasion should realize, is that politically they're in a relatively desperate situation. They're in a survival situation, you might say. They're in a survival situation in the long term rather than the short term, but it's definitely a survival situation. And the one thing that you can't afford in any survival situation is any kind of bullshit. You're not going to that party anymore. Your goal is not to get to the party. Your goal is not any of these sort of frivolous things that you might have considered really important 45 minutes ago. Your goal is simply to survive. And so when your goal is simply to survive, the most important thing becomes discarding illusions and focusing directly on simply achievable things. And so when you talk about, if I can return to this analogy of you have to build an engine that runs on apple juice, your engine, when you're thinking about all the things that go into designing an engine for, to win, the Le Mans, race next year, all those things are kind of out the window. You just want to be able to roll a little bit. But just rolling a little bit will solve your survival problem. It won't give you all the sort of things that you want. And so I think that American voters still, very much too much, think in terms of luxuries, where if they look at their situation 50 years ago, let's say you could have gone to the voters of California in, say, 1956 and shown them a picture of California in, say, 2020 or 2016, let's say 2016. And you're like, okay, California is going to look, look like this in 60 years. And, they would be like, no, we're going to keep California from looking like this. We're going to elect Governor Reagan. And, if you remember Governor Reagan's speeches from the 70s, or People's Park, or, went down in Berkeley, I mean, it was pure balls of fire. I mean, the man was to the right of Goebbels, or that's what all, good liberals were supposed to think. And then the sort of wave washes so far, it washes up into Washington. And when it gets to Washington, it's half an inch deep. And, and it had half an inch deep, it's still 1,000 times deeper than the Trump administration, no offense. And so, what you would say is, well, hey, California voter of 1956, you think you're saying no, you think you're standing on the track saying no.
66, by the way, is when Reagan was elected.
I know. But in 56, that was kind of the high water mark of Reaganism. That was still, Ed Brown, but the forces that would elect Reagan later were coming, were spreading. This was Birchers were everywhere at that time, and that force of specifically Southern California right-wing radicalism. What was his name? There was a guy, the guy whose daughter married the teenage Samoan. I forget. That story. Yeah. Right. Name. And so that I can't remember the name. Schmidt, maybe. But it was sort of this dying wave of California conservatism. And, what you would tell conservatism is, when you look back over that record, it's not just that everything you did was too little and too late. It was way too little and way too late. And so, when you apply that lesson for today, you're like, wow, now you're much, much weaker, and it's much, much, too late. It's like, let's take, for example, the rollback of crime in the 90s. The rollback of crime in the 90s was the result of, this kind of Archie Bunker voter that got it together. And it's like, well, maybe all of this theory that they've been telling us, the social science that we've been hearing about the 1940s, about how, you're not deprived, you're not depraved, you're deprived. Maybe it's all wrong, and we should just start putting people in jail again. They just start putting people in jail again. Crime goes down, Then people are like, oh, it's a big mystery. Why are we putting all these people in jail when crime is going down, right? And the thing is, the fundamental problem has not been at all solved. It's not been sort of close to addressed to. You used the power that you had, which was this legacy power of this old dying America, to win an election and get this thing that you wanted, but you still weren't thinking in a survival way. You were still thinking of, oh, I'm cold, I got to warm myself up. So instead of walking over there, you're like, build a fire. with your last match. Okay, great. You built the fire. Now the fire is out. Where are you going? What are you doing with that? Right? What are you doing with the time that you fought there? You're not doing shit. Right? And so in a sense, when I look at American conservatism, I see basically people who raise a lot of money by, you know, sort of presenting these measures and these perspectives that at best are only palliative. And so I'm like, you have to realize that you're basically questioning
American conservatism is a grift. Hillsdale College and the Claremont Institute accepted. Okay, yeah. I dispute one thing, but it's an important thing, which is I'm very much still an ancient in this regard in terms of my political outlook, is that there is no solving the fundamental problem. So getting back to the magic wand, right? This is a thought experiment that occurs in a number of philosophic books. I can think of the two that leap to mind are Plato's Laws and Machiavelli's Discourses. What if you put yourself in the perspective, hypothetically, of the founder? You have a blank slate in front of you. What are you going to do? So let's say, you know, the chessboard has been cleared. We have the pieces in the box, the three of us, or, you know, some small committee of us, or one of us, whatever. As Machiavelli says, one must be alone in order to found something anew. But let's say that, you know, 3 or 4 of us like-minded people start. Where are we going to put the pieces, right? I immediately think, what am I trying to do? And that is to say, if my goal is solving the fundamental problem so that the regime, you know, even Hitler said his Reich was only going to last 1,000 years. 12. So he was, what, 988 short, but he didn't call it forever. There's no forever in politics. Even if you're the most grandiose messianic tyrant, there's no forever. But what are we trying to do? We're trying to do the best we can for as long as we can. This to me, the big takeaway from, say, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Xenophon is we can resolve these fundamental problems for ourselves as individuals, but only for ourselves as individuals. Right? The political problem is soluble for me as a person, but not for society or for humanity. That's not to say, though, in fact, it's that we therefore disengage from politics and go off into a monastery and not care. There's a number of reasons why we don't want to do that. Just for self-interested reasons, if all I want to do is study ancient texts and think, my ability to do that absolutely depends on the quality and the character and the functioning of society around me, so I have to care. But also, if I have any level of sort of small h humanity in me, I do care about what's going on in the rest of the world. I care about whether the world is predominantly suffering in injustice, or whether some of the ills and evils of society are mitigatable or even solvable for the time being. And because I'm human, right? I'm not so much a citizen of the world. I'm inevitably going to be the citizen or a partisan of a particular community, a particular people, a particular culture, a particular civilization, a particular tribe. And I'm going to care about them probably more than I care. Well, to the modern liberal, caring about what is near you is the sign of Neanderthalism, right? The more you care about, you know, the famous Berkeley bumper sticker, think globally, act locally, right? And it eventually just becomes think and act globally. The more you care about your cousin and your friend and your fellow and your neighbor and your fellow citizen, the more that just proves that you're a caveman. But I think it's human nature to care about these things. And so what we ought to do, we ought to try to do the best we can for as long as we can if we're the founders. But we have to realize maybe this is the fundamental flaw of the American founding, is that they seem to believe implicitly that their new science of politics would create a regime that would last forever, when Plato and Socrates and Aristotle would have said, no, it won't, nothing will. And my best regime that Plato would say, the best regime that I put together in the Republic and in the laws is more ambitious and utopian than yours. And that even isn't going to last forever, right? There's no solving this problem. So you do the best you can for as long as you can. And to the extent that you're acting politically, and then to the extent that you're acting individually, you know, conceivably you can solve the problem.
Michael, right? The founders were obviously great students of Rome. So much of it echoed and or stolen or just simply mimicked. Don't you think that are you saying that you believe that the founders thought that they were creating something that would last forever? I mean, being such students of history and of Rome, wouldn't they have necessarily believed that there was a finite time period to what they were doing?
Yes, I'm just saying you can look when you read. What one of their mottos, Novos Order Seclorum, new order for the ages. They justify, in the early Federalist Papers, they use the phrase more than once, but certainly once, that the reason why we can build this new republic at the territorial extent that we can, they say, Republics are a problem. They've failed throughout history. Why are we making this new, if Curtis were there, he would say, don't make this new government a republic. It's going to fail. The founders realized this was a serious argument, that in fact, Curtis's opinion in the 1770s and 80s that republics will fail was much more prevalent among elites than that the republic might succeed, which is why they have to spend the first 14 Federalist Papers defending their choice to make the United States a republic and not some other form of government, because the presumption is that republics are discredited and will not work and will not last. And they use the phrase in justifying themselves. At one point they used, I forgot which number it's in, but they use the phrase new science of politics. In other words, we've learned things that the ancients and the medievals and prior political actors didn't know. That new knowledge makes this thing is going to be better and on a firmer basis. Now, they don't anywhere, as far as I can recall, say this is going to last forever. But there's a kind of implication that, no, if we've solved all of these problems, maybe it will. All I'm saying is...
Well, born in hubris. Curtis.
No, I don't mean that. I don't mean that, because being a just last point, being a Hillsdale Claremont person, I'm not really allowed to disparage the founding, to say the least. All I'm saying is we all have to come at any kind of political, when we're thinking about the wand, we all have to come at it with a certain humility, that even if you have magic, there's probably a whole bunch of things that you can't achieve. And so you got to lower your expectations, and therefore not lower your intentions. Don't be too messianic or too utopian. Try to, as I say, try to do the best you can for as long as you can, realizing that will neither be perfection, nor will it be perpetual.
Magic isn't good enough to change history. That's awesome. Curtis.
Well, I'm a big fan of Napoleon. In fact, there's a book I always recommend, which has now become, unfortunately, a little expensive in used books, called The Mind of Napoleon, which is just a collection of his sayings, of his writings that was put together in the 50s by some professor. And if you can find it before anyone else, I recommend doing that. Napoleon, I particularly like this book because I gave it to a prominent startup guy at one point, and he loved it, and started recommending to everyone else too, because Napoleon was the startup guy, and Napoleon dealt with this promise of creating a novus ordo seclorum in a very different way, because Napoleon, the closest equivalent of Napoleon on our side of the pond is, of course, Hamilton, and Hamilton himself was in some ways one of the least philosophical of the founders. Hamilton was a practical guy. He certainly was not, he wasn't a firebrand of the streets like James Otis or something. Can I deprecate? Would you be allowed to, what about Sam Adams and James Otis? Can you say bad things about them in like Claremont political correctness? The Samuel Adams,
Curtis, you have vastly greater freedom than I do to say whatever you want.
We're all constrained by YouTube, though. Don't forget.
That is true. That is true. I'll keep it philosophical. And but the thing is, my philosophy is, in a way, it's sort of, my political philosophy is in some ways the opposite of Michael Anton's, which is that I think the way forward is in a sense out of philosophy rather than into it. And so, Michael is like, let's work hard on developing the philosophy of what is the right, what is the good government. Let's think hard about this. Let's have our seminars. And I'm like, this does not really sound like the survival imperative to me. What sounds like the survival imperative to me is much more along the lines of, okay, you're 70 million people out there. Each of you has this little slice of power. You have these little ideas about what the future should be. You're like, I'm for this, I'm for that, I'm against this, I'm against that. No, forget all of that. Your philosophy doesn't matter. What matters is, are you for it or are you against it? Which side are you on? And that's sort of what happens naturally as the society sort of, I recently read that I think a majority of Americans describe the country as being in a cold civil war. And as you sort of move toward war, you move towards kind of focusing that energy. And that, when you think about politics and you think about voting, that should change the way you think in a kind of survival imperative sense. And if I could wave the wand, the one thing that I would say to Americans when they vote is that they're sort of not voting in the right spirit, because they're kind of voting in this kind of participatory sense to feel like they're in charge of something. They're kind of voting in this kind of Aristotelian sense of participating. That is not the sense in which they're the most powerful. And when it's the survival instinct, when survival is really the question, and the only way that you can survive is by getting enough power to build a fire. And in this case, the fire either happens or it doesn't, and the fire is essentially regime change, then you need to think about the way you vote in a very different way. Because when you vote today, you're sort of thinking, oh, I'm going to send Donald Trump to Washington and he's going to be my delegate. And he's going to do, I want to build the wall. So I'm going to send Mr. Trump to Washington and he's going to build the wall for me. Gets done, okay, the wall isn't built or has all these holes in it. Oh, well, Mr. Trump failed me. No, actually, the way you have to vote if you want to be effective is you want to say, I have this power. I don't know what to do with this power. I'm going to give it all to Senor Trump. And you have to sort of enter into this kind of very south of the border spirit of caudillismo. And one of the theories about why Trump did so well with Hispanics is not that he's so politically correct, but that they're basically racist and fascist to an extent that we don't really understand here in this country. And they responded to Trump's caudillismo. And which was clearly, to compare Trump to a caudillo is like, certainly in the rhetoric, it's there, right? And so the thing is that the
not
spirit,
so much in the action.
of course, not so much in the action, right? And the spirit of caudillismo, like,
some say that as a lament, I might add.
Porfirio Diaz, yeah, action. There are many. Let me explain how I interpret action. Porfirio Diaz, in Mexico, his guys. He was not of the Mexican nobility. I think he had more of an Indian background, or at least a mestizo background. His guys were called the Científicos, and they were basically like, okay, start up Mexico. What are we going to build? What are we going to do? And if you imagine essentially startup America run by startup guys, I don't even care what color they are. I mean, not the color of their skin, but even the color of their politics doesn't matter at a certain level. Just burning all of this stuff down and changing it out with people with, Blue Caesar, if you will, people with completely identical politics, but a structure that actually works and completely different personnel. That's enough. I don't care about the philosophies. And I don't think Americans
that's a great place for me to butt in.
I think they think like
what I was going back to was your comment earlier, which I think you made in a friendly way, but came off as disparaging. Is like, well, you cares about all this philosophy. Look, when your survival is at stake, well, behind every decision, behind even every contemplation about what kind of action you're going to take is, when you say, well, what do I do now? Right. Okay. You're evaluating that based on what you think is good versus what you think is bad. Okay. So just a basic question. It seems self-evident. Survival is good. How do you know that? Unless you've thought about it, right? So philosophy lurks behind every single question you could ask.
Sure.
The fundamental question of Greek philosophy is, of course, how should I live? Right. So before you know what to do, before you can make a decision about what to do, whether that's a political decision or a personal decision or whatever, presupposes an evaluation, a hierarchy of ends, of goods and bads that you've thought through. And where philosophy comes in is it says, we know that this hierarchy of ends already exists in public opinion, but if we subject that public opinion to analysis, we realize that it's contradictory or it's flawed or it's illogical. And I'm not saying that, the answer is for all of us to just sit around and read books and debate. What I am saying is that but you do need some people to do that, I think, or whether you need them or not, inevitably some people are going to do that whether you want them to or not. However, if we're going to go forward to what any of us wants, even if we presume that the three of us all want different things, right? Whatever future Curtis that you want, or what I want, or what Jack wants, or what any listener wants, all of that presupposes an idea of the good and then a prudential account of how we approach the good, of how we avoid the bad and get to the good, which requires thinking. Right? It's not as simple as
it does. And it requires this is required in practice as well as theory. I should pitch my Substack is actually one of the things. My paywalled articles are a book, and my book is about Gray Mirror, is about this subject of what do you do when you wave the magic wand, and that includes the telos. That includes the question of what should this world look like? Should it look like fully automated luxury communism? Should it look like the pasture full of last men? No, I don't think so. I don't think any of us think that. And answering that question and answering how sort of humanity constructs itself in a way that makes it remain human is in some ways the ultimate question. And I think where I differ from that is I cannot imagine anything that could be described as a successor regime not grappling with that question at a very existential level, simply because it would have to. And if it was not an existential regime change, if it was simply a cosmetic regime change, and the level of sort of things that are in between fake and real is dwindling constantly. It's becomes more and more Boolean, more and more true false every day. And so the question of sort of how this next regime would contemplate reality is very, very important. But if you can't really even agree that the only word that you need to say to the present regime is no, this doesn't work for me. No, we don't have to live this way. And you basically, the problem is that once you get into philosophy, you find yourself instantly engaged in this Laocoon-like debate with the frame in which you exist. And this frame, which is this frame we inherited from the 20th century, is just like, has no redeeming qualities as far as I can tell. And so, it's actually very easy. Politics is the art of cohering sort of many, many small efforts on a single point. It's like focusing a laser. And so to me, it's very, very easy to focus the laser on the word no. It's very hard to focus the laser on, let's debate what the government should have the right vision of, the $15 minimum wage or whatever. And so those are thinking in those different ways and sort of pulling you out of the thing that I support philosophy completely. The problem is that when you think of philosophy as sort of your political method, it pulls you into this quagmire that's very hard to get out of.
What a fascinating conversation. I know we could go on forever. I have a million things I would like to drill down on. I want to go back to heroic kingship. I want to talk about the goal is to survive. I want to talk about a million things, but we are out of time, my friends. Is there anything that you guys would like to take us out with? 30 seconds, plug a book, plug a Twitter feed, a Substack. Michael, Anton, where can people find you?
I have no social media presence. I have no social media presence. When I write, I tend to be either at the Claremont Review of Books, at The American Mind, or at American Greatness. I did do something recently. My most recent thing was for Law and Liberty because I was asked to do that. I noticed, being prickly and thin-skinned, I've been attacked a lot lately. It seems like 4 different attacks on Law and Liberty alone. So I asked the editors, hey, I'm going to respond to all of these people. Will you take it? They said, oh, sure, we'll take a look. So I'm working on that now. We'll see when and if I get finished. The one thing I do want to sort of semi-plug, and Curtis has seen it, it's very much unfinished, but I've been amused by it, is I began writing a kind of parody of Plato's Republic, but if it were written by the Wokies. I call it Beto's Republic, and the main interlocutor is Wocrates. I have written book 1. Eventually, when my time, I have a huge course load this semester and next semester, so I'm just chewed up by course prep and lectures. I would like to write all 10 books of the Woke Republic. Look for that. I probably will just self-publish it if I ever get around to finishing it. But look for that maybe, I don't know, in the middle of the year or next year. After that, who knows what I may do. I don't know.
Well, thank you for that, Michael. I appreciate it. Curtis, what about you? Where can people find you? What are you hustling? What's up?
You can find me on Gray Mirror with an A.substack.com, and you can subscribe for the free version or the paid version. The paid version offers only a little bit more, and basically what I tend to do is when I'm sort of rephrasing a thought that I feel that I've written before, because you can find my old archive at unqualified-reservations.org. Then I'll do it for free. But if it's new material, I feel that I need to make the world pay, because, as the great Samuel Johnson said, no one but a fool ever wrote but for money. I do. Maybe they don't want me to do this, but I do endorse Substack. I think it's a wonderful platform, and so far they seem very principled in their determination to uphold freedom of speech. But these things can always change. But you'll find me there while I'm there.
Indeed.
Thank
Awesome.
you so much for having us, Jack.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you guys very much. I appreciate it. You guys can find me at Jack Murphy Live on Twitter, here on YouTube. Smash that like button and subscribe. Share this with all of your friends. We will also be releasing this audio version on the Jack Murphy Live podcast next Monday. Please do sub to the YouTube channel. There are new videos every single day. And we're going to take you out with a little something that my producers have been working on. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, everybody, for paying attention and following along. I, too, felt like an observer many times throughout this conversation, but it was fantastic. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys very much, and we are out. In this show, we're driven by curiosity. We want to chart a path forward. Best people, best conversations. We're on a journey, and it's just getting started.